A mother-in-law berated her pregnant daughter-in-law, and having overheard her conversation about inheritance. There are people in life who always see the good in everything, and there are their complete opposites. No matter what happens, everything is wrong for them. The weather's bad, their shoes are tight, the bus is late. Grace saw herself as the second type, and she wasn't ashamed of it. What's there to be happy about if things aren't really good? Grace grumbled. Let the naive fools rejoice in high prices and shabby entrances. I wouldn't think of it. You should be happy about your pay, your drink, your table, and your own success. All other joys are not useful, because the contemplation of beautiful things will not bring money, and a piece of joy in your pocket will not add and will not buy bread for dinner. Water prices have jumped again, Grace muttered, poring over utility receipts at the table in her kitchen. They can't live in peace. They're just trying to get more money from people. The woman was a hypocrite in the best traditions of female sense. She herself worked in the communal office and knew the whole kitchen from the inside. And Grace complained not that prices had jumped, but that her position did not allow her to stick her hand in the trough available to the management. She was angry that someone out there was buying a fur coat or a car, and she, Grace, was getting a pile of butter. And it wasn't just at work. Grace looked askance at her younger sister Natalie, who had married a military man and had secured a secure old age. Natalie's just lucky the women at work gossiped. She had her eyes in a bunch and he thought she was not a bright girl. So he got married. Who needs a smart wife? Men want to feel like kings. That's just it. Her office mates nodded and expressed full solidarity with Grace. They, like her colleague, were not in marriages that were worth bragging about and being proud of, so they loved to gossip together. Gossiping and looking for reasons for what happened anywhere but genuine love and respect was what Grace did both at home and in relationships, always being the boss. She reluctantly married Edwin, what is called gilding the pill. Then a young guy, Edwin, dropped out of technical school and went to work to provide for his wife and little son Alex. And so he was left without a profession, and now he worked as an electrician or plumber in the neighborhood. In general, he gave his wife no reason to brag. Grace nagged her husband that he didn't have a decent shirt to go out in. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked in a muffled voice. "We can go to the shop in tights. But where else? To the theater? To a restaurant?" Ugh. Tamara spat in her heart. "All you know is to pick your toilets and screw out light bulbs. No taste for beauty." Both in their own and in other people's, clarified the husband, and immediately fearfully stretched out his neck like a turtle. He was so afraid of his wife that he did not admit it to himself. Grace let her husband in more out of boredom or habit. At work she had to wash her hands of the empty-headed visitors to the utility office or the neighbors. And at home she had to do something. Therefore the poor man was reproached for business, and without business for burnt patties, for dirty floors, for neglected tools. The squeak of the calculator mingled with the whistle of the kettle on the cooker and the hum of the restless sparrows outside the window. The old wooden frame of the window door to the balcony, adjacent to the kitchen, was lightly touched by the wind and creaked. The glass reflected the glare of sunlight directly into Grace's eyes. She wrinkled her nose and pulled her glasses off. By the age of 50, women could look gorgeous, or they could turn into a womanizer. Grace thought she was in the former group. In fact, no matter how hard she tried to look younger, her whole self was relentlessly striving for the latter. Not a haircut in the latest fashion, not vintage gold rings from a modest inheritance could not prevent it. Quite the opposite. Grace, with her husband and only son, lived in a small 2-bedroom on the first floor of a row 5-story building. One of those that had already disappeared into the dense foliage of the trees that had once been planted around them. And even though every year their branches were trimmed, the flat still had a favorable shade. It was good in summer, but in winter the flat turned into a dark box, and it became quite dreary, like a dungeon. A key turned in the hallway, and then there was a commotion on the threshold. "Alex, have you got the bread?" Grace shouted without greeting into the darkness of the narrow corridor. "Dad's got nothing to eat with his soup." I've got it," the son said, taking off his trainers. "Is Joyce here yet?" Grace cringed at the question. Her daughter-in-law annoyed her in principle by her existence in the common area. But it was time for her son to get married, for he was past 30. Grace herself had told him that it would be a good idea to think about the continuation of the family. The son thought about it, got married. You'd think he'd be happy, and still it was not so for Grace. She expected her son and daughter-in-law to move out. And the girl also turned out to be from a poor family, without her own living space and special prospects. And now she and Alex were occupying his room, crowding the hallway and queuing for the bathroom in the morning. "Your wife didn't turn up?" Grace said to her son, still holding back a hint of squeamishness. She was probably going out with her girlfriends, and after work she was eating her paycheck. Alex only sighed and put 2 loaves of still hot bread on the table. He worked as a driver at the bakery, so the house was always full of baked goods. It was periodically given out to the employees from under the table or as a write-off, although they didn't mind. Alex brought loaves and buns, bagels and bagels from work to defend the honest name of the driver. "You should talk to Joyce about getting another job," Grace persisted. "She's sitting in the ticket office at the railway station, neither here nor there. When she's on maternity leave, she'll get paid a penny," Grace said, looking at the receipt for the repairs. "And what kind of work is she doing when she's 5 months pregnant? No one will hire her." "I'm working." Alex hesitantly stood up for his wife. "Soon I'll take a new route to the suburbs. They'll pay more." "Well, who prevented you from quitting earlier?" Grace persisted. "I would have quit this mess a long time ago. I could have gone to the grocery store, or the storekeeper, or the market. You'd make more money. And my wife will weigh tomatoes from the counter or climb through boxes in the dust in the warehouse." Alex objected gently. "I, my dear, have weighed boxes and climbed the counters." Grace turned to her son with her hands at her sides. "You can't do anything." Alex had developed an immunity to his mother's nagging over the years. He didn't argue with her like his father, staying calm, but he couldn't go completely against her either. So Alex grew up realistic and realized that he didn't have enough brains for a good education, and his parents didn't have enough money. Therefore, after school, the guy served in the army, sitting over papers. When he came back, he finished college as a motor mechanic. Sometime he worked at his father's friend on a construction site, and later by chance he got a job as a driver at a bakery, and since then he settled down in a warm place. Alex didn't have much luck with girls. Short romances happened, but no long-term relationships could not be built. And it wasn't hard to guess why. Grace had a dog-eat-dog attitude to everything. Son then fell into disfavor. Then she urgently needed him to take her somewhere. Then she scolded him with the last words, then tearfully begged for help. This state of affairs did not suit any young lady, and Alex was naturally lonely. The guy didn't even try to dream about his own place. Exorbitant prices for new flats caused only a feeling of fierce indignation. He would never have saved up for them. And however it was not very pleasant to live near his parents, but it was convenient cooked food at home and cleanliness. Except that Mom's nagging spoilt the picture. Well, it had been that way all her life. Grace resigned herself to it, eyeing her son with a scrutinizing gaze, looking for another reason to pick on him, but there was nothing to pick on. She herself had long dreamed of moving out of this flat and into a spacious house. But as the years passed, the opportunity never presented itself. Her mother had left Grace only a room in a communal flat. At one time, the money from its sale went to repair the 2 rooms in her son's wedding. No matter how petty the woman was, but she didn't want to make a nuisance of herself in front of her neighbors and acquaintances. Therefore, the celebration was held traditionally and solemnly. The wedding was over, burying Grace's ghostly chances of moving. There had been no other chances since then. Edwin appeared timidly in the kitchen. After greeting his son, he began to warm a couple of portions of soup in a small pot on the cooker. As he did so, he tore a piece off a fresh bun and, scattering crumbs on the tabletop, began to devour it greedily. Edwin. Grace banished him at once. "I only hoovered everywhere yesterday." A flock of sparrows flew noisily outside the window. Edwin squeaked and stared awkwardly at his wife. Alex took the remaining bread, wrapped it in a bag, and put it away in the bread box. He was used to clashes at his parents' house. More precisely, to his mother's domestic attacks on his father. Grace was obsessed with cleanliness and demanded order from everyone in the house. And she would get furious when she saw an untidy fork or, God forbid, crumbs on the tablecloth. Alex mentally thanked Providence that Joyce was very clean, sometimes covering for him. quietly sweeping rubbish from the tabletop and vacuuming the floor, removing crumbs after night tea parties. A towel flew on Edwin at his wife's profanity, and he grabbed the unfinished soup in a pot and hurried to the balcony, miraculously managing to grab a spoon. Alex, rather out of habit, shook his head and went to his room. Soon he had to go to meet Joyce from work. If she was late today, it meant she was filling in for someone. The August sun was setting late. Before it did, it cast an amber glow over the city, heralding the coming of evening. At such a time, trees and houses cast long, creeping shadows, and artists were inspired. It was a time when pensioners and couples went for walks in the alleys of parks and made dates in the open verandas of cafes. At such a time, Joyce returned home, observing the world around her. From the outside, a girl with her hair in a white shirt and blue skirt could be mistaken for a schoolgirl or a student. In fact, Joyce simply observed her working dress code. Who needed it, though, anyway? If you sit behind the glass all the time, and the passengers can see you from the waist up. The question was rhetorical. Joyce sat down on a bench in the alley and took a bottle of water out of her bag. She had been drinking a lot since the beginning of her pregnancy and had been careful to carry a supply of fluids with her. She looked at the pink clouds in which the setting sun was drowning. She always tried to see the bright side of life, no matter how strange and prickly it was. Joyce had grown up here in the city, in a tiny flat on the outskirts, where they lived with her mother and then her younger brother. The girl didn't know her father. She and her mother separated when she was 1 year old. Her mother did not like to talk about this topic, and Joyce was not eager to ask. Later, Mum had a man, and the girl's brother Michael. They lived together as friends, though they lived in close quarters. Joyce realized even then that seeing only bad things around you could drive you crazy. So what if the flat was small, but everything was close at hand? Mum worked hard to support the family. First she worked at a printing press, then she went to work at a cannery. Sometimes she worked as a nurse or babysitter at weekends. No job is shameful if you do it with heart, she told her daughter as she rolled up jars of compote in the tiny kitchen. That's how Joyce remembered the most important thing. You can be a good person no matter where you live, what you do, or what you see around you. So from a young age, she tried to help her mom with everything. They lived poorly, but in love and harmony. Joyce learned to appreciate the little things at candy from a neighbor, a bouquet of flowers picked hastily from someone's flower bed from her brother Michael, a butterfly perched on her shoulder. She also always secretly expected gifts from life. Childhood faith in miracles played out, and so much so that it persisted into adulthood. A piece of childish directness attracted her husband Alex. Because of her, the girl was considered a weirdo and at school. But Joyce was so used to it that she didn't care about anyone's opinion. A happy person does not think about others. Joyce had a cherished dream to meet her prince, but not on a white horse, but just such a prince who would be like a stone wall. At first, Alex seemed to her like that. Tall, broad-shouldered, kind, he lifted her like a feather in the air, and at every meeting treated her with sweet pastries. And when he proposed, Joyce glowed with happiness. At that moment, she was not embarrassed to live with her husband's parents. Even on the contrary, in her mother's flat, she occupied a small corner, and here she and her husband would have a whole room of their own with a bed, a wardrobe, a TV, and the opportunity to close themselves and spend as much time as they wanted in each other's company. For the wedding, Joyce made a lavish dress and even cried when the wedding ceremony took place. After all, everything was like in her favorite fairy tales of Beautiful Hall. Many guests, congratulations, dancing. But a little time passed and something else from fairy tales came true. A wicked stepmother, a mother-in-law. Before the wedding, Joyce knew her poorly, and at first it seemed to the girl just a strict and strong-willed woman. How was she wrong? For a year of life with her husband, Joyce understood that the mother of her chosen one, a real autocrat. And even innate optimism could not cope with this tyrant, who now waited daily for her in the new house. Once the girl stuttered about moving out to a rented flat, but Alex only waved his hands. The rent prices are huge, and if there is still a child, we'll be living on breadcrumbs and water. Just to survive, he eloquently argued his position. If so. And soon Joyce realized that she was in an interesting position. On the one hand, she rejoiced. On the other hand, she sighed, imagining that the birth of the baby would only add to the mess in the flat. Alex, having learnt about the pregnancy, was very happy and began to beat out additional routes at work to earn a little extra money. And Joyce herself realized that it was too late for her to change her job and she would have to be satisfied with modest maternity payments. Sometimes the girl dreamed that she lived in a big house with a high ceiling and in the evenings went out on the porch to watch the sunset. But these were only dreams that dissipated as morning came. In the distance, the familiar figure of her husband loomed in the alley. Alex ran up to her, hugged her, took her bag. The usual conversations about her well-being, her mood, the past day began. Joyce answered, but in the background it seemed to her that they were only covering something important, some deep problem that everyone was afraid to stir up. After all, everyone knew the name of that problem. When they returned, the flat was quiet. Grace was watching television in her room, as evidenced by the sounds coming from under the closed door. "Are you hungry?" Alex asked, helping his wife to take off her shoes. "Yes," Joyce admitted. They went into the kitchen. Alex opened the fridge and sighed disappointedly. "I think Dad's used up all the soup. Let's go to the shop. I'll run down and buy something quick, because you're eating for two." "And there's not enough for one," he said a little guiltily, looking at his wife. "Well, go, we'll cook together later," Joyce smiled. Alex dived back into his trainers, took his wallet and ran away. The girl's stomach rumbled demandingly. There was an unpleasant taste in her mouth, the kind you get when you don't eat for a long time. Joyce went to the sink, washed her hands, put the kettle on the cooker, and looked in the fridge once more. She knew that goodies never stayed in the house for long. It was the same for her and her mother, a familiar pattern. The coolness of the refrigerator echoed the dreary picture: a jar of pickles, containers of some kind of porridge, raw eggs on the door, onions and potatoes in the vegetable drawers. Suddenly, behind the jar of pickles, Joyce noticed a nice piece of doctor's sausage in a bag. Hunger dictated its own rules, and the girl, not thinking long, pulled out the find. A mug tea, a couple of movements with a knife into pieces, and now two terribly unhealthy, but so tasty sandwiches of white bread with butter and sausage are ready. The kind her mum used to pack for snack at school sandwiches, and now took Joyce back to childhood memories. She chewed blissfully, drinking the flavored tea. Joyce was snapped out of her memories by the caustic voice of her mother-in-law. "You didn't buy the sausage, and you open the fridge more often than I do. You should ask before you take something." Joyce almost choked, it was so sudden. "But we live in the same house." She tried to defend herself. "One family doesn't share everything. Why don't you take my toothbrush then, dearie? Or your father-in-law's socks?" Grace bit her sister-in-law again. "It's common, what's the point of moving?" Joyce couldn't find anything to say. But she couldn't eat a bite after saying that. She put the sandwich in a bag and put it in the fridge. Grace squinted at her sister-in-law, looking at her own power in the flat. When Alex returned from the shop, the kitchen was already empty. He found his spouse reading a book in the room, offered bought fruit, frayed omelette, croutons. Joyce did not refuse the food, but was somehow quiet and taciturn. Alex did not question his wife. She fell asleep on his shoulder watching a film. The man carefully covered his wife with a blanket, deciding that the morning was wiser than the evening, and tomorrow everything would be fine again. Grace was the earliest to get home from work. She was usually home by 4 o'clock. And lately the woman's mind was occupied with thoughts of how their family would live. Embarrassed by the arrival of a child of grandchildren, Grace wanted to send her son away and make him find a wife, but she wanted in her usual possessive way. That is, that the grandchildren would be there, but somewhere out there, would not annoy her and would not disturb her in any way. This was not possible under the current circumstances. The woman, accustomed to control, silence, cleanliness and order, was horrified to imagine what her established life would turn into with the arrival of her son's firstborn. At the same time, she thought back to her years of early motherhood, and wrinkling her nose, the memories did not bring the slightest joy. There were two ways out: to try to get her son and daughter-in-law out of the flat, or to break them up and make her daughter-in-law and her newborn baby go to the family. Grace, having reflected, came to the conclusion that the second option suits her better. After all, Alex can help and heavy weights to carry, and on the working car to take to the business, and regularly brings fresh bread free of charge. And the daughter-in-law only knows that to empty the fridge and go to her work to look like it is decided. The son needs a bride with a large dowry, not with a torboa from the wrong family of old junk. Grace cared little for her son's feelings and other spiritual nonsense. He'll figure it out somehow. He's not a little boy, she thought. The woman opened the door, walked into the hallway, and loaded the grocery bags on the floor. It was decided to get to the plan today. The sooner her sister-in-law vacated the flat, the sooner there would be a guarantee of the peace and order that had always reigned in Grace's domain. Joyce did not see anyone today, so she had to leave early too. In the morning she had spotted large, juicy peaches in the vegetable shop near the railway station, but she didn't have time to buy them, she was late. And then all day she cherished the hope that by the end of the working day they would still be left. She hoped for good reason. She noticed from afar that there were only 3 juicy fruits left in the basket. The girl almost ran to the shop and, without haggling, wanted to take the desired delicacy. Someone called out to her. "Joyce, wait, please." A guy about her age waved his hand, apparently catching up with her from the railway station. Joyce, perplexed, froze in front of the vegetable shop. Having thrown the shop assistant out in some bewilderment, the guy finally caught up with her and took a breath under her questioning gaze. "How do you know my name?" the girl asked, clutching her keys in her pocket just in case. "You had a name tag on your chest half an hour ago," the guy replied. It wasn't hard to remember. Joyce remembered. Really, it was so obvious. "Please just don't think that I'm some naive kid who decided to meet you. I'm not a crazy guy either." He said all this with a completely serious face. The girl was confused. The situation was too atypical. "And what do you need from me in this case?" she asked her interlocutor cautiously. "The thing is, I'm your younger brother?" The boy frowned a little embarrassed. "I have a younger brother, and he looks different," Joyce replied. "It's a prank, a joke. Where are the cameras?" She got angry for some reason and started looking around. No, not that the boy waved his hands. "Let me explain. Let's just sit over there in the square. It'll be a long story." Joyce raised an eyebrow incredulously, then glanced at the money in the hand she still held. "All right, I'll just finish what I started." She nodded at the peaches. When the luscious fruit was in the customer's possession, and she was sitting in the shade of the curly linden trees in the alley nearby, the boy introduced himself. "My name's James, and let's go by you." Kind of like we're not so old, kind of related. The latter is still in question. Joyce gave him a cursory glance. Something in the appearance of the sudden acquaintance touched distant strings in her soul. It echoed a familiar feeling from a distant childhood. James pulled himself together and began his story. Joyce listened to him, and the more time passed, the more conflicted she felt about what she had heard. Joyce's father and mother had separated because of the former's infidelity. He left to a woman who became pregnant with James. With her, he built a new family, created a business, and bought a large house in the suburbs with a garden and fertile land. For 15 years, the happy life continued. And then it was as if a bucket of misfortune spilled on the man. Sick and dying relatives, stolen car. A business partner let him down for a large sum of money. All these misfortunes lasted for another 9 years. When his beloved wife and his son's mother died of cancer, the man could not stand it and went to seek salvation in the church. There he met a blind fortune teller who dispelled the mystery of his misfortunes. He left his children in poverty and betrayed the woman who gave birth to you. So she wished you to suffer in your heart, as she herself had to suffer once, the fortune teller said, looking over amber beads in her hands. If you want to atone for your guilt and go to the other world in peace, then divide everything you have gained equally between your 2 blood children. I'm not going to the next world, Harry answered her. Man, that's not for you to decide, the fortune teller laughed hoarsely. He tried and hurried to get away from the crazy grandmother. But her words still wouldn't come out of his head, and when Joyce's father soon found his favorite woman dead one winter morning, he changed his mind in a moment and wrote a will immediately after her funeral. Wait, take your time, Joyce stopped her brother with a gesture. How did he even know where I was, how I lived? Daddy left us when I was a baby. I don't know, James shrugged. Dad was a respected man. and he had a lot of useful connections. He told me how to find you." "What do you mean?" Joyce realized just then why her brother had found her. Yes, James confirmed her thought with a touch of sadness. "It's been 6 months since he died. We have an inheritance to make, sister." Joyce was completely petrified and stared into the serenity of the August day with a detached gaze. Father, brother, fortune teller. The inheritance. So many things had never happened to her at once. It was as if someone had roughly pulled, measuredly spun the film, and it whistled before the eyes of the audience, showing its frames. Joyce felt dizzy. "Are you all right?" James picked her up as she slid off the bench, only then noticing her belly under the girl's loose blouse. "Yes, I'm afraid you're going to be sick." Joyce reached into her purse for a bottle of water. "Let me send you home in a taxi now. You think about it, take it all in. I'll see you in a week, and we'll talk," James said. "Okay?" He nodded meaningfully at her stomach. "It's best not to be nervous when you're in your condition. If I had a car today, I'd drive you myself." Joyce agreed. What else was there to do? The whole thing seemed too unbelievable. She knew one thing for sure: she mustn't tell her husband about anything, let alone his family. She would have to think with her own head. Though maybe she should seek her mother's advice. No one liked Sunday in the flat, because everyone stayed at home, and periodically there were domestic quarrels, in which of course the role of the main was occupied by Grace. Her power was based in the kitchen, and she paid mental tribute to anyone who entered her lair. Joyce stretched in bed and didn't find Alex beside her. Her husband was used to getting up early, and he didn't disturb her sleep, only covered the door to the corridor so that the morning noise wouldn't disturb his wife. Joyce was usually thirsty in the mornings, a thirst that had developed in the second trimester. She stretched once more, got up, put on a homemade t-shirt, comfortable shorts, and quietly walked out into the corridor, heading for the place where all people usually went in the morning, the bathroom. "Your Alex is eating more and more," I heard the muffled voice of my mother-in-law from behind the kitchen door. "And we are not millionaires. She herself buys almost nothing in the fridge. But how she eats." "Of course, Mom, she's pregnant. She's supposed to," Alex answered tiredly. "She eats a lot." "Call her," Grace nodded, tapping her spoon on the mug of tea. Joyce instinctively froze round the corner. She was well aware that her mother-in-law obviously liked to criticize her, but this was the first time she'd heard it with her own ears. If she wants to eat a lot, let her buy it herself. She has a habit of eating other people's food and then putting something else in its place, Grace persisted. "Recently I bought an expensive sausage for a salad. I hid it on purpose." She found it and started making her own sandwiches. Shameless. Joyce felt herself boiling with anger and shame at the same time for her husband, who had swallowed those words from his mother to her. It wasn't just the accusations that made her boil, they were unfounded. She had always bought exactly the same amount of groceries as others. The question was that fresh herbs, fruits, vegetables, good cereals, and fish, mother-in-law did not complain. She considered sausages, cheese, tinned food, potatoes, mayonnaise, fatty meat, pasta, sweets as food. Joyce didn't want to listen to any more of this nonsense. But she clearly understood that her husband was afraid of his mother and was unable to protect his wife in front of her. And what would happen when the baby came? Joyce preferred not to delve into this question, knowing what the answer might be. It became even more obvious that the information about the inheritance from her late father could not be told to anyone in the family. The girl wrinkled her nose, imagining how predatorily her mother-in-law would reach for such a prospect. But no, this was her, Joyce's, life. Hers and her child's, who should not grow up in such an environment of pettiness and perpetual tension. She deliberately stamped her heels loudly on the linoleum into the bathroom. The voices in the kitchen fell silent, later changing the subject. The girl washed her face, decided to go straight to her home flat, without going into the kitchen. She had no desire to eat breakfast. Half an hour later, Joyce was already diligently putting on her shoes, sitting down on the floor in the hallway, when surprised Alex looked out of the corridor. "Where are you going?" he asked Joyce. "To my mum's. I haven't been there for a long time. I'll come over for tea," the girl answered. "Can I give you a lift?" offered her husband. "No, I want to get some fresh air," Joyce replied discreetly. Maybe she suddenly began to cause him pity and irritation. For all its positive qualities, dependence on her mother after 30 years had negated them. Alex shrugged his shoulders in confusion. "Call me if you need anything," he asked, and walked his wife out. The flat where Joyce spent her childhood greeted her with the familiar smell of her mother's retro perfume with lily of the valley and a dim lamp in the corridor. "Come in. I've baked fresh cakes. Will you eat them?" Vivian shouted from the kitchen. They embraced, and over a cup of tea with fragrant homemade pastries, so different from the bakery buns, Joyce dared to start a difficult conversation. Her mother's face changed when her daughter told her about her meeting with James. Vivian was silent for a while, twirling the mug of drink in her hands. "I kept waiting for you to find out," she said, not looking her daughter in the eye. "So you knew and you didn't tell me." The girl jerked forward in astonishment. "Yes, I knew. But don't be too quick to judge me." The woman was careful to support her impulse. "Your father called me last year, hesitated, repented, apologized, and asked me to take back my words. And I, my daughter, am a proud woman. I may have nothing more than this house and 2 children." Vivian circled the walls and ceiling of the room with expressive eyes. Joyce listened to her, almost breathless. "I turned him down because there must be justice, I thought. It worked. Now let him pay for it. I realize now that I should have forgiven him in peace. It's been a long time. But the old feelings in that conversation got the best of me," the woman continued. "I certainly didn't wish death on anyone. And you, my daughter, do as your soul tells you. Whether you take the inheritance as a debt for a fatherless childhood or accept it as a gift of fate is up to you. Think about yourself and your future child. I'm not a counselor." Joyce leaned back in her chair. A future plan of action was forming in Joyce's mind. She drank her tea thoughtfully, set the cup on the tabletop. "I have more questions." Joyce glanced meaningfully at her mother. Vivian nodded. "Were you angry at Daddy for leaving me fatherless? But now I'm wondering if I want to do the right thing for my own child," Joyce said vaguely, and at the same time very clearly. The woman opposite smiled thinly and sighed. "I knew you wouldn't be allowed to live peacefully in that family," Vivian said shrewdly, tilting her head to the side. "Alex, you're a nice guy, but you know." Joyce nodded. "You're here. I'm not going to give you any advice," her mother said after a moment's silence. "You've already made up your mind. Why should I advise you?" Vivian expressed with one look her complete acceptance of her daughter's decision. "Don't be afraid. That's the main thing," she added. Joyce had always known that her mother understood her without words and had a very good sense of understatement. So why did she have to worry when even her mother had been clear about her and Alex's marriage for a long time? Joyce looked round the interior of the cafe. She and Alex rarely allowed themselves to go out for pleasure. Spending a lot of money on a single meal was an unacceptable luxury for their family. Tonight she was here to talk to her brother, who had arranged a meeting in a more decent place. "So you agree to sit here?" James asked after the greeting. "I think it would be silly to turn it down," Joyce hummed. The waiter placed 2 glasses of flavored tea and a small dessert in front of them. "I thought coffee wasn't good for pregnant women. And the sweet stuff is a good mood booster," James commented. "And I can treat my sister." Joyce smiled, pleased with the attention, albeit unexpected, from her own family. "I suggest we do this without ceremony and long preambles," James began in a businesslike manner. "Did you bring the documents I listed in the message?" "Yes, here. Check it out." Joyce pulled a folder of papers out of her bag. While James studied the contents, Joyce voiced a question that had suddenly come to mind. "Tell me, why did you decide to share your inheritance with me? Couldn't you have kept quiet or made sure I didn't get anything?" "That's a good question," James said without looking up from his papers. "You may think I'm an idiot, but I've seen my father in pain, especially the last couple of years. I don't want to repeat his fate because someone who's offended will curse me. Moreover, I already have my own place, a good flat here in the city. My father bought it when I was far from 18 years old. So the most I'd be interested in is some of the money from the deal, if you decide to sell. I'd invested in my father's company." Joyce calmed down. James put all the documents back together. "If we hurry, We can get most of the paperwork done today." He pointed to his car under the windows of the cafe. Yeah, I'm just finishing up." Joyce awkwardly began to eat her dessert with a small fork. James laughed. "Come on, there's no rush. There should always be time for goodies." He waved his hand, drawing the waiter's attention. 15 minutes later, the two of them were already outside and seated in James's car. Grace was watching, and so unluckily was nearby. "I knew that girl was crap," she said, as if praising herself. "Not only does she eat like an elephant, but she has a lover." "Oh dear, so it could be a child from him. That's it. Now I'll keep her away from my Alex." The woman almost burst out of anger, standing on the opposite side of the street and looking at the car with her daughter-in-law and a strange guy. It was worth rushing home to give her daughter-in-law a warm welcome upon her return. The landlady had been in such a hurry. Joyce didn't get home until the evening, and Alex and Edwin weren't there yet. Either the two of them had left for a part-time job, connected with the moving of acquaintances. Dragging wardrobes, beds, and bedside tables when there was a commotion in the corridor, Grace prepared to tumble out of the room and unleash her righteous anger on her sister-in-law. She was already savoring her grievances and rehearsing her most barbed phrases as she looked through the door of the mirrored wardrobe. Criticizing and venting grievances on people, what could be more pleasing to an old pepperbox, she thought. But suddenly Grace heard a phrase that stopped her foot from taking the first step. "Yes, tired, of course," Joyce said over the phone. "It's all right, pregnancy's not a disease. Some people lift weights at the gym, but here it's just an inheritance from Daddy. Don't worry, but thanks for the fruit." Grace had a ringing in her ears. Her face changed from a grimace of prepared curses to a foxy nose of curiosity, for there was a glimmer of profit ahead. "Yeah, when we move into the Heritage House, I'll grow my own," she thought. "Yes, I'll wait for your signal about the next meeting," Joyce said. "Yeah, bye." She disconnected the call and finally started to take off her sandals. Grace realized there was no way she could give herself away right now. Also, the greedy woman's eyes immediately flicked to a picture of a huge house with a garden, land, and lots of money. Here it is, the opportunity to set yourself up properly for retirement. All I have to do is get the naive pregnant fool round my finger, make it work for me. And to hell with the lover, whoever he is. Let the daughter-in-law do whatever she wants until she gets the house, Grace decided. Joyce sighed tiredly and cautiously glanced into the kitchen, then into the hall, where her mother-in-law was snoozing peacefully on a chair with a magazine in her hands. The girl took a breath of relief. "Why don't you eat chicken?" Grace asked Joyce sternly at the table. "Here, have another piece. It's homemade, not some factory broiler. I got it from an acquaintance." At the stunned stares, Grace placed a succulent, gravy-laden piece of chicken leg on her daughter-in-law's plate. Joyce stared at it dumbly, as if she'd had part of a frayed tire placed on her plate. So wild and absurd was this sudden preoccupation that everyone stared. Grace looked round for a moment with her old look, but quickly hid it. "I have a grandson growing up, actually," she said. The rest of the dinner passed in absolute silence, which was nonsense. Grace was usually at the table gossiping and grumbling, and the rest of the group tried to mute their hearing so they wouldn't absorb this stream of negativity. A week had passed since the second meeting with James, and the final stage of the inheritance process remained. He suggested that Joyce go and see for herself what she was going to own. She didn't refuse, but she had to come up with an ironclad excuse for being away from home on her day off. Joyce pondered over it for a long time, but came up with nothing. Fate had given her a suitable option. A colleague had asked her to take over for her next week, and she herself was ready to work for Joyce. In the flat, the girl tried to behave habitually and not to give away anything that was going on in her life. Alex was habitually caring, but at the same time aloof when it came to getting out of his comfort zone. Edwin either slept in front of the TV or went to his part-time job. He was almost invisible, with only the occasional glimpse of his father-in-law's gray head in the corridor. Grace, on the other hand, seemed to have put a different record in her head. She suddenly became unusually compassionate, polite, and courteous to Joyce. She was interested in her health, her mood, and her diet. But it was like an elephant trying to fit into a ballet tutu, inept and strained. You could see that her mother-in-law was pushing herself very hard, but for some reason she endured it. Joyce did not believe that Grace had suddenly developed a great love for her future grandchild. The possibility that her mother-in-law knew about the inheritance, the girl immediately dismissed. Who would? "Alex, what's the matter with your mother?" she asked her husband after dinner. With a smile like hers today, she couldn't eat a bite. "It's like a Stanford wife," Alex said. He paused for a few seconds, remembering the allegory, but then he continued. "I'm surprised myself, but I'm glad you and Mum are getting along. You should be glad that you don't have to swallow your wife's barbs every day without being able to intercede." Joyce's mind flashed immediately, but she prudently said nothing aloud. The next day, Joyce met her brother James at the agreed place, and they drove to the right address. Her father's house was on the opposite side of town, far away in the private sector, with nice and neat yards. Joyce even gasped when the car parked in front of one of them. Yes, this is it," James joked, noticing her astonished look. The girl saw a neat two-story house made of light brick, surrounded by the same fence with beautifully wrought bars. A neat lawn with bushes and small trees grew near the yard. Already inside, beyond the gate, there were several paths lined with yellowish tiles, a lush flower bed and ivy growing decoratively up the front wall to the balcony on the first floor. "Wow, didn't you say you lived in a real castle?" Admiringly and slightly wary, Joyce ran her hand along the brick of the house. "You didn't ask, did you?" James shrugged. "It doesn't look like anyone lives here," she said. "Everything's so neat and tidy." "I asked one of the neighbors to keep it tidy for a nominal fee," James said. "I don't want it to become overgrown. Even though I've been living somewhere else for a long time, I still cherish the memory of my childhood here. My father planted this garden for me when he was looking for peace from the troubles he was going through. I remember him planting the trees, watering the flowers. I'd love you to keep some of his labor if you decide not to sell the house." "I wouldn't think of uprooting or changing anything on the outside," Joyce confessed fervently. "It's just fine." At the same time, a pang of guilt began to gnaw at her for the lack of contact with a man she'd only seen in her childhood. James took her through the rooms of the house, telling her how it had been built and furnished, and Joyce's eyes were filled with images of the life of a foreign family, as if she were the one running barefoot on the fluffy carpets. As if she had fallen asleep in the arms of her father's favorite dog, as if she had sat on his lap in the evenings. "Hey, what's up? Are you okay?" James noticed her wet eyes. No, I've missed him so much my whole life. I just realized that now," Joyce said, stammering and wiping away tears. She snuggled into her brother's chest. James put his arm around his older sister and gently stroked her back. "He wanted to communicate while you were little, but your mum forbade it. And then he gave up trying. She wouldn't even accept child support money from him. A very proud woman, your mother," Vivian, James said. "I can see now why he listened." The fortune teller. They talked for a long time in the big, empty house, even drank tea from a neighbor's supply. It seemed to Joyce that the puzzle she'd almost forgotten about was finally coming together. "Why don't I give you a lift home?" James offered. He looked at her in surprise, and she shook her head. "What's with all the secrets of the Madrid court?" Joyce hesitated, not knowing how to explain her position clearly. James didn't rush her, but he watched her shrewdly. The car looped through the city streets, stopping lazily at traffic lights. "I don't want my husband's family to know about the inheritance, and about you," the girl said at last. "I must have married the wrong person." James was silent, but nodded understandingly. And Joyce started to drift off. She kept telling her brother about her husband's poverty, about her mother-in-law's tyranny, about feeling like a bird in a cage, about being afraid to stay with a small child in this family. And with a baby alone in a big house. "So you're not afraid?" Raised an eyebrow at my brother. "It's better that way than to have to endure the daily nagging and reproaches that I ate an extra piece of sausage," Joyce said hotly. "I've been thinking about this," James said suddenly. "You can have the house all to yourself, and I can have my father's business and my own flat. Besides, I don't think you can run a company, because you don't know anything about sales. I've been at it since I was a teenager. I think that's fair and equitable to everyone." "Of course it is." was all Joyce could manage to say in amazement. "I was grateful to you, and now I don't know what to do." "It's nothing." James waved his hand in a worldly fashion. "Call me in for pies or borscht a couple of times. We're even." Joyce laughed, nodding to her brother. All her fears suddenly seemed so childish and pointless, but she had to overcome the last of them to figure out how to escape from the beast's lair. Grace swiftly slammed the window in front of the next person who wanted to pay a utility bill. Break. That's it. "Wait," she shouted at an elderly man who stood at the window with papers in his hands. "He goes to his own house. We're not a housing office, and we don't live in Paris to serve them every day," Grace grumbled as she entered the tiny kitchen of the housing office. It could only be called a kitchen. It had only a microwave and a kettle. Even the refrigerator was gone. The once good Soviet appliance called berated was stolen by local businessmen under the pretext of repair. The pretext was soon forgotten. The refrigerator settled down at the dacha of one of the employees of the office. After all long argued, grumbled, but no one was willing to chip in for a new refrigerator. And it was impossible to get it out in the bureaucratic system of the communal structure. So the workers kept all their simple dishes in cold time on the windowsill and in warm time in the far corner, where it was cooler. However, from time to time someone still had something spoiled, and then the kitchen was filled with unpleasant odors of rotten chicken or sour cabbage. In especially bad cases, the odors even reached the visitors, and they would run their noses in frustration, trying to find out the source of the unpleasant smell. Today, too, the improvised kitchen smelled of something almost spoiled. Laura brought her stinking cutlets again, Grace grumbled, wrinkling her nose. If she didn't care about herself, she'd at least care about us. She took her foil-wrapped container out of the microwave. It prevented the food from heating up quickly at room temperature and spoiling. Grace was having a blast at work, berating her colleagues and visitors for the fact that at home with her daughter-in-law she had to hold back, and sometimes in such a way that the woman literally boiled over from the inability to scandalize or reprimand anyone at home. Of course, everyone but Joyce still got it, but it was familiar and uninteresting. It was her sister-in-law that Grace longed to sling mud at. But she couldn't for the sake of their big house. They'd put up with this bedbug they were living in. "What's the matter?" Grace's girlfriend, Monica, came out. Grace poked at her glumly, but immediately put on a semblance of a smile. "Just complaining. I'm also trying not to die of suffocation. Laura keeps something smelly in here," she nodded at her colleague's chest by the microwave. Monica wrinkled her nose and waved her palm in front of it. And then Grace had an idea for a discreet but effective way to discuss her plan to take someone else's property. Monica was, of course, a gossip, and she couldn't be told directly. But to disguise the story in the guise of someone else's life, why not? Monica, Grace began. "Children are supposed to help their parents, aren't they?" She sat down capriciously opposite at a narrow table with a cup of tea and a packet of biscuits. Monica looked at her colleague with interest. "Well, let's say they should," she agreed cautiously. "These are normal children. And there are brats like my innocent. They're on the computer. Neither clean up after himself, nor make his bed. And you can't even dream of getting more help," Grace said with a wry grin. "I didn't want to hear about my bum son." "I've been thinking," Grace interrupted Monica's lament. "If good children always help their parents, they should share everything. We feed them, put them on their feet. But what if they want to get a better job at our expense? What can we do?" Monica propped her cheek with the palm of her hand and stared at Grace ambiguously. "What's all this high talk, Grace? What's all this about crime?" Grace banged her fork on the table indignantly. "What does this have to do with Alex anyway? I was watching a film last night. I thought I'd be culturally enlightened, discuss the plot with spiritual people." She even turned away and pouted her lips, which was more characteristic of a silly schoolgirl than of an employee in her late teens. It worked. Monica immediately started apologizing and asking about the film. She didn't want to quarrel with Grace. She could turn the whole team against her and make caustic remarks at every opportunity. Grace enjoyed a tiny victory for a while, then she said, "So I'm watching this film, and then bang, at the most interesting part of the fuse blows and Edwin is not home to fix it. So I was left without an ending. And now I'm wondering, what was the film about? What was the film about? Monica looked into her eyes and asked. Grace had been waiting for that question. She inhaled greedily and began to retell the plot of her own family history in the guise of a film, of course, changing names and adding details but leaving the meaning unchanged. And at the moment when the heroine overheard a conversation about the inheritance, everything and knocked out. That's a shame. And I didn't even remember the name of the film, Grace complained for real. Now I'm wondering how it ended. Monica, who was not so stupid. Halfway through the film, Monica realized what Grace was telling her. But she didn't let on and continued to nod obediently like a Chinese dummy. So her mother-in-law was planning to appropriate the sudden inheritance. Poor Edwin, Monica said with pitying lips. She won't be able to do it directly because the relationship between them is already spoilt. That's so, Grace nodded. Most likely she tried to put pressure on the orphan with the help of her son. She trusts him. She doesn't see any danger. Wives are supposed to listen to their husbands. Grace barely restrained herself from snorting. If she had listened to her husband, she would have been scrubbing toilets at the railway station or in some third-rate canteen. According to her own observations, her husband had grown older and had not given any constructive ideas for 15 years. So the son has become leverage, Grace said. Smart move. He's the one we're testing everything through. She muttered the last phrase almost inaudibly, so that Monica could not understand. In the end, the film probably ended with the family moving into the daughter-in-law's house and living happily ever after, Monica concluded. You can't do a bad ending anymore. You're not supposed to upset family values. Although in real life the poor orphan would either have been turned into Cinderella or left to live in the old flat under a plausible pretense, Grace resented herself. There's no way I'm going to let her live in my bloody meters when we move, she muttered. I'd rather rent it out so I can get some money. She was dreaming so much that she involuntarily leaned back in her chair and closed her eyelids. The image of a big house with a plot of land and a terrace for tea parties and gossip was already in her mind. The envious glances of Natalie's sister and her husband, the neighbors and everyone around her. At the same time, Grace realized that Joyce wouldn't make a very good housekeeper, but someone would have to clean and cook. She herself had done enough work and deserved a holiday. Her mind was full of languid thoughts, and she did not notice that her hand had touched the cup of tea she had made at the beginning of lunch. The cup tipped over with a clinking sound and doused Grace's skirt with the no longer hot drink. There was swearing and fiddling. Monica hurriedly handed her colleague a packet of dry wipes and ran out of the kitchen, out of harm's way. In her irritation, Grace could hit anyone who got in her way. When Grace got home, she decided not to put things off and went straight to Alex. He was home trying to fix the hinge on the door to the room that had fallen off. We need to talk straight, Grace began, leaning against the wall behind her son. No offense. She'd never been very gentle with her family. She was a straight shooter, and Grace cared little whether her claims to her husband or son hurt other people in the queue or neighbors who went out for a smoke on the bench. It is not difficult to assume that with this approach, Grace's family was notorious, and no one in the house was friends with them. Did something happen? Alex tensed. Such a statement from his mother did not bode well, as practice showed. Grace hesitated a little with the answer, but then fell out sharply and in the most shrill voice. The inheritance happened. Your wife's. Didn't you know about it? Alex turned pale and dropped the screwdriver. What? Vivian died? She didn't say anything to anyone. How could she? Ugh. Grace threw it back as if she'd been handed an old bread roll instead of a sweet bun. She's alive. She's the healthiest of the living. Your father, Ben, gave your family the house. Alex breathed a sigh of relief. He liked his mother-in-law. It was always cozy and homely, despite the cramped and simple life. She didn't tell me anything about that either, the man muttered, sitting down on the floor. Father? She had never seen him except when she was a baby. I won't lie to you, son, Grace assured him. I heard it with these very ears. She twitched her ears, as if she were talking about it on the phone. Like, we'll move into the Heritage House and get on with it, Grace said. Wait, we'll figure it out. Why didn't she say anything to me? Alex scratched the back of his head. It doesn't take much time to think about it. Grace immediately joined in. It's clear that the girl doesn't want to share with anyone, even though you're her husband and we're relatives too. Now she's disrespecting all of us. How can that be? Alex looked around the floor and walls as if searching for an answer. And you have to talk to her and put it into her empty head that a woman can't manage the house alone without a man, Grace admonished, nodding vigorously to her son. We'd better all move there, start a household, help with the baby, and keep this flat. Your father and your neighbor have renovated it to make it look newer? Yes, we'll rent it out. His mother's words flowed into Alex's ears like a stream. But the bottom of the stream was viscous and rotten. No, he suddenly jumped up from the floor. You're lying. Grace was silent for a moment. So sudden was her son's change of mood. She wasn't used to him crossing her so abruptly. So that's why you've been courting her for the last weeks, Alex guessed, and I, naive, believed that you two would really get close. And it's all about the inheritance. Maybe so, Grace whispered angrily. But don't you want to live like people, with a yard and a garden and a separate house? At the price of someone else's humiliation? No, thank you. Neither you nor your father will get an inch of Joyce's inheritance, Alexander said, pulling himself together for the first time. The situation hurt his soul so much that he dared to confront his mother. He loved Joyce, but in his own way, like a flower growing in a tight pot. Oh, you're so cross, you little puppy. Then you should know that your Joyce has a lover who goes out to restaurants with her, Grace said. Apparently she's preparing a place for him in the hereditary house, and she'll give birth to a child and throw it on your doorstep. Alex was silent. Then, like a little child, he covered his ears with his hands and jumped into the room. The door slammed. The faint click of the lock was heard from inside. Grace's cheeks were flaming, though she had not got her way. But she'd put her son in his place for thinking he had an opinion in her flat. Joyce returned home in high spirits. The thought of being a couple of days away from getting the deeds to the house warmed her more than the summer sun. She noticed her husband on one of the benches near the familiar entrance. It was atypical. Alex never went outside for nothing. The spouse's look was absent-mindedly lost. The girl approached, said hello, and cautiously asked, "Why are you here? What happened?" Alex looked up at her with sad eyes. In his hands he was twirling a branch hastily broken from a bush. "You have a lover, is it true?" he said sadly. "Some people say." "What kind of nonsense is that? What makes you think that?" "Mum told me." He averted his eyes. "Did she see you with him in the cafe?" Joyce quickly put the events together in her head and realized what had happened. She even breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that she was spared the humiliating need to justify herself. "Alex, you see, that's my brother, but not Michael, the other one. On my father's side," she said carefully. "So the story about the house inherited from my father is also true?" Alex said, not addressing anyone in particular. Joyce was stunned now. "How do you know about it?" Instead of answering, Alex looked at her sadly and at the same time nodded at the balcony of her native flat. "I see." Joyce sat down next to him. Now the picture became clearer. "Why did your mother have such a sudden love for me? What a marvelous woman." They sat in silence for some time. Each of them collected his thoughts. Alex was the first to do so. "Joyce, do you know how I feel about you?" he began, choosing his words. "But I feel the same way about Mum, no matter how arrogant she is. I realize she won't let you off the hook with that inheritance. And if she doesn't get hers, she'll ruin our whole lives, even from a distance. She already tried to put pressure on you through me today." I objected. Joyce listened to her husband, almost out of breath. She realized that it was almost the first time he had made the right choice in taking her side. She also realized what it had cost Alex. "My mother has always hated our flat, always wanted to move into a house," he continued. "But you see, we live modestly. We can't afford such luxury. And here is such a gift of fate. Of course, Mum would die to get your house. I don't want you to put up with her attitude all the time. It's not going to change. And I don't want our child to grow up with an unhappy mother." Alex put his hands on her fingers. "You need to get out of here, and fast. I'll help you." Joyce couldn't believe her ears at first, and then tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she hugged her husband tightly. "You have no idea what you have done now." 3 years later, Alex stopped at a familiar two-story house. He took a long look at it every time before he got out and rang the bell. Now the house and the yard around it were covered with snow that hid the sun. A merry flock of sparrows hopped about in the bushes. Today was the birthday of his and Joyce's daughter, Beatrice. A lot of water had passed since that unfortunate August and the conversation at the front door. Alex had planned Joyce's escape so that no one would suspect a thing. When Grace left for work, Joyce and her husband started packing hastily. Then, like criminals, they quietly carried the bags and packages out to Alex's work car. He drove her first to Vivianne's house, and then he and James helped move her into the Crown House. Joyce had no idea what was going through Grace's mind when she found out about her escape. Alex was silent, but it was clear from his tired face. Grace must have screamed for a long time, because once Joyce dialed her husband's number, she heard such a torrent of filth about herself that her hands shook. When Beatrice was born, Alex had helped come round for a while, but then he'd been less and less frequent. Joyce suspected that her mother-in-law was also to blame, singing songs about a fattened child and a mother who had run away. But she wasn't going to despair. James also helped with his niece, and at the same time offered his sister a part-time job in his firm as an accountant, remotely. He brought her a laptop, brought her up to speed, and the girl quickly got into the work. She had done this kind of work before she met Alex, and now she was remembering the details as she went along. In between caring for her daughter and working, Joyce caught herself thinking that she hadn't loved Alex as a man for a long time. Warm feelings remained for him as a person and a friend. But the feeling of security with him was gone. The girl thought long and hard about how to tell Alex about her decision, and at the next meeting she confessed that she no longer had feelings. Alex listened to her silently and then said that if he were Joyce, he would have done the same thing. So they decided to divorce. Was it for time or for the sake of their daughter? Alex exhaled vapors, rubbing his gloved hands apart. In a beautiful bag he had a gift, a large teddy tiger cub. The man rang the bell. A couple of minutes later the lock rattled and Joyce, wrapped in a warm woolen scarf, appeared before him. "Come in." "I've already set the table," she said hurriedly. "Mom and Michael are here, and James will be here soon." They went inside the house, slamming the heavy door. Inside the house smelled of baked goods, and familiar voices could be heard. Alex hung up on the hook in the hallway, leaving his shoes on the shoe rack. Joyce had blossomed in 3 years. Her eyes brightened, a blush appeared on her cheeks. Even her figure was slimmer, despite the labor. "Oh, I've been telling you all about it. And I forgot to ask about you," she said. "I moved to a hostel from my mother, and now I'm slowly saving for my own flat," Alex answered. Joyce froze in amazement in front of him. "Wow, congratulations. That's really great." She hugged her former spouse respectfully. "How did you do it?" "Not without labor," Alex said with a sigh. "But I realized that I wanted to be free of her too." "So today we celebrate not only our daughter's birthday, but also someone's freedom?" Joyce asked a little slyly. "It turns out that way," the man agreed. The girl smiled, and they went into the room, where almost the whole family was already gathered round the table. It was time to give presents to the little birthday girl. To save a fading mother, the daughter sang in a restaurant. And as soon as she saw her, how hard it is to choose between study and work sometimes. And sometimes it happens that life does not give a choice, and you have to study and earn money from a young age. And it's okay if a person is driven by a bright goal, a dream. But what if everything comes from despair and fragile hope? Megan stopped thinking about all that a year ago. She just forced herself to get up in the morning on autopilot, walk to college, sit out her classes, then come home, eat, change, and run to work at the restaurant. "Megan, daughter, you're only 19 years old. Live your life." "What's this for?" the woman said. "Mom, I don't want to hear such questions anymore." The girl hastily packed a rustic snack with her to work and answered. Don't talk nonsense. You need to study, fall in love, laugh, be friends, be happy, not ruin yourself in this pub until morning." Amelia sighed, following her daughter with her eyes. Megan remained silent. She only lightly nudged the rocking chair where her mother sat with her knitting. The chairs rustled quietly on the floor, bending the slides. The conversation was standard and had been repeated regularly once or twice a week since the girl had found the job. And in a provincial town, nobody wanted to hire a full-time student with incomplete education. So the only thing to do was either waitress or cleaner. Megan chose the lesser and more profitable of the two evils. Yes, she had to run a lot with plates, tolerate caustic, nagging guests, argue with the administrator and the chef. But in addition to the income for the shift, the girl brought out often good tips. Who knows, maybe Megan would have worked as a waitress if one day the owner of the restaurant, an elderly man, Harry, did not hear her singing quietly at the sink. Carefree and beautiful, Megan was pulling a once loud hit song. The song had passed her by in the car on the way to the restaurant, and it had stuck in her head all evening. "My little star, why did you hide your talent?" Harry asked, coming up behind her and clapping his hands together. Megan, startled, turned around embarrassed. She was sure that in such a secluded corner her singing was unlikely to be heard by anyone. As always, though. Even from early childhood, the girl was drawn to music, sang at all matinees in kindergarten, then at school, on holidays, sang in the local house of culture, until she graduated from high school, sang at home every chance she got. Oh, Megan. God sees the stage is crying for her, praised her for her eyes, neighbors, grandmothers on the bench at the entrance. It always seemed to the girl that she sings softly. However, on the ground floor, it was difficult to hide such an activity. "I've been saying for a long time that the restaurant needs live music," Harry said, putting his arm around her shoulders and leading her into the hall. "And here's a bird singer like that going missing. It's not good. We'll make a stage, put a microphone on, and you'll be singing, not serving cognac." Megan had no time to object, but a couple of days later her employer fulfilled everything he had planned. He met her at the staff door before her shift. "Today, my starlet, you will eat for us, and tomorrow you will please the guests," he smilingly told the waitress. However, the waitress Megan still had to stay. After all, every day in the restaurant was hard, and the voice could be planted in the first month. Therefore, performances with live music and songs were in the institution only on Friday and Saturday. Megan got a good percentage from them. The rest of the days, the girl still wore a waiter's uniform and nimbly walked around the room, putting tips in a secret pocket of her shirt. Harry had no complaints about the singer's voice, but there were complaints about her appearance. One day, the receptionist gave Megan a little more money for her shift. "That's a bonus from the bosses," said the fox-like Agnes, waving her red mane in the direction of the performance outfits. "Go and buy a couple of dresses." Megan nodded. Agnes was 7 years older than Megan, but she acted like a star and was not shy. "No, I don't need any," said Megan. "What's not to like about the way I look on stage in a skirt, jumper, and trainers?" she asked, not looking at Agnes anymore. The girl took the money, wondering how to get out of the awkward situation. What was it? Megan didn't work because she was a career woman, or because she was saving up for an expensive dream. She saved almost all of her earnings for her mother's cancer treatment, and the two of them lived on the modest leftovers. When Megan was 17, Amelia began to have ailments, and eventually doctors found out that she had kidney cancer at the second stage. Naturally, the woman could not work further with such a diagnosis. The savings she had saved for a rainy day were quickly spent on treatment and examinations. Her mother's illness forced Megan to grow up in a few months, tough and without question. Not buying a performance dress. "There will be questions. They'll ask me to return the money or work it off," the girl mumbled as she sat in her car, going through the notes she had received. "I'll buy my mom some medicine. I won't have enough for the doctor and medicines until the end of the recently prescribed course." After her shift at 2 o'clock in the morning, she was driven home in an old Toyota by a kind cook, Aunt Natalie, who lived on the way, but a little further away. "What are you muttering about?" Jerking the handbrake, she turned back to her passenger. "You reckon, Megan?" "Thank you. See you tomorrow." Megan hurriedly said goodbye. She jumped out of the car, slammed the door shut, and waved goodbye once more. The old Toyota responded by revving the engine and slowly drove away with her owner. The ostentatious smile disappeared from Megan's face as soon as the girl entered the house. She walked over to her mother's bed, listening carefully to her breathing. Every time Megan was afraid to come home from work and not hear the most precious sound in the darkness, the breathing of a loved one. She carefully adjusted the blanket, switched off the lamp above the bed, took the book out from under Amelia's arm and tiptoed to the bathroom, then to her room to rest. Tomorrow was Saturday, a day off. At least she could get some sleep. But sleep did little to rest her body and head, nor did it solve her problems. The question plagued Megan all the way home. "Why are you looking so down? Are you tired, my daughter?" Amelia asked, noticing her daughter's tired look. "Just here," Megan said as she separated the scrambled eggs on her plate with her fork. She shared her worries with her mum. Amelia was about to send her daughter to the shop for outfits, but Megan beat her to it. "And don't tell me you can spend money on tinsel for the stage." "Not in my case," the girl pressed her lips together. Oh, Amelia shook her head and thought. She understood the whole situation and was afraid herself. What rags if every month you have to buy new medicines? But on the other hand, I support your desire to sing and I'm glad you're not burying your talent. Megan, against her heart, went to college to become a chef. A person who can cook will never sit without money, although she secretly dreamed of becoming a vocal coach someday. "You know, I think I have an idea," Amelia said, fixing her fringes and turning her head towards the old cupboard at the end of the corridor. Megan followed her gaze, perplexed. "There's all sorts of old stuff in there, old boots, ski poles, junk. The receptionist would either laugh at me or kick me out of my rags. It's rubbish." "Don't rush, it's just right for the restaurant." Amelia waved her hand and awkwardly got up from her stool. "There should be a green box on the top shelf at the end. Take a look." Megan grabbed the stool, went to the cupboard, and began to actively dig through the dusty but sometimes necessary household junk. Soon a green box did indeed appear in the girl's hands. Amelia carried the box to the table, dust flew off it, and she looked at her daughter questioningly. "Open it, what are you looking at?" she smiled. Megan hesitantly lifted the lid. A white cloth studded with cornflowers came into view. A little more, and in her hands was a little old-fashioned dress just below the knees. "Mum, where did you get it?" Megan asked, an undisguised joy in her voice. "Memories from my youth," Amelia replied. "It's been in my wardrobe, forgotten for about 30 years. It doesn't fit me, but it will fit you, and it'll last." Megan rushed to hug her mother, then ran off in search of an iron. The evening was saved. Outside the Jeep's window, oncoming cars, road signs, the side of the evening road. "Tell me, Brian, why did I go to that factory today?" Bernard asked his driver. "I don't get it." "Judging by the fact that you were met there at noon on some important business," Brian grinned discreetly into his mustache. "I know important business," Bernard grumbled. "They only take you where the equipment is new. And it's clean because it's been dusted the day before. It's a health inspector's paradise. Shoes, cockroaches, all sorts of rubbish. Maybe someone will make an anonymous call, and that'll be the end of it." Cautiously, almost in a whisper, Brian suggested. "If it hadn't been for my old friendship with the manager of that factory, I'd have closed down the Trofimov and Sausages shop a long time ago," Bernard said tiredly. Brian's stomach rumbled loudly. He shivered uncomfortably and froze in the driver's seat. "Are you trying to retire early, Brian?" Bernard grinned. The driver gave him a questioning look. "What do you mean?" Bernard grumbled. "Working in unfavorable conditions, nervous, hungry." A few seconds later, there was the bass laughter of two men in the car. And hardly anyone would have seen in this conversation a superior and a subordinate, or rather the mayor of the city and his personal driver. A few kilometers later, Bernard's stomach rumbled demandingly. "Oh, damn their sausages," he said to Brian, pulling the car over. "You and I are both going to retire early with gastritis." "I know a place," Brian remembered. "It's old-fashioned, but the food's great. It's about 20 minutes away. Oh, you're robbing an important person. Bernard wagged his finger at him jokingly. My conscience won't forgive me. To kill a superior, a commander, and a friend in one person. And so it was agreed. The men spent the whole day on a business trip and ate nothing but coffee and a couple of buns. Of course, their hungry stomachs grumbled, creating awkwardness, though it was hardly real for two people who had known each other for over 30 years. Having met during the service, Brian and Bernard had never parted again, with one clearly possessing business acumen and leadership qualities. The other led a quiet life, content with what he could earn. So when Bernard became mayor of the city, he didn't even think about who to hire as his personal driver. Brian was the only one he trusted with his informal side in his life. An oncoming car gleamed its headlights on the bend. The restaurant behind him was beautifully lit with garland lights. The Jeep swerved into the car park. Through the high windows inside, they could see waitresses scurrying about. Caucasian cuisine, Bernard asked, glancing round the place. They make better luliak bebab there than in New York, Brian said authoritatively, starting the car. Bernard pulled on his jacket, and they went inside. A businesslike, red-haired receptionist ran up to the men at once. Good evening. Pleased to meet you. Do you have a reservation? Good evening, Bernard replied, smiling at the girl. We'd like to sit somewhere a little further away, somewhere quieter. Agnes let out a silent gasp, recognizing the head of the town at last. But then she instantly pulled herself together and invited the men to a cozy table by the window. We have live music tonight, and the main hall will be noisy, but here you won't be disturbed. However, if you call me, we will solve any question. She put a bell with a button on the table, and once again smiled radiantly, and disappeared. However, her place was immediately taken by an equally polite waitress. Brian and Bernard studied the menu for a short while, and after a couple of minutes they ordered. It's a nice place, said the head of the city, looking around the room. I was passing by, but I didn't have a chance to look inside. My wife and I celebrated our anniversary here, said Brian. Let's have a look, Bernard said, spreading his fingers. The first dishes and drinks appeared on the table. Dinner had begun. Meanwhile, the restaurant began to fill up. Workers bustled around the stage, checking the equipment. A guy with a guitar appeared from somewhere. Dear guests, Agnes looked round the room in a businesslike manner. Every Friday and Saturday in our restaurant, you can not only taste the best Caucasian cuisine in the city, but also enjoy live music performed by a talented beginner singer, Megan. A girl appeared on stage and took the second microphone. We should finish eating soon and drive to my place, Brian asked, looking back at her. But there was no intelligible answer. Bernard scrutinized the young stranger on the stage, who was already clapping her hands to the most famous song by a popular singer. He did not take his eyes off her, watching her movements, catching every sound. It was as if he saw a distinct piece of the past on that stage. The white hem was studded with blue cornflowers. The mother-of-pearl buttons sparkled in the stage lights. He would have recognized this dress from 1,000 of its kind. Yes, his eyes had not lied. It was the same dress he had given to the girl he loved 36 years ago before he left and lost her forever. Amelia, shouted her mother from the balcony and waved the telephone receiver through the open window. Hurry up. Bernard's calling. Yeah, I'm coming. Amelia hurriedly spread the sheet on the rope and hooked a couple of clothes pegs. She grabbed the empty basin and sprinted home from the courtyard. Hello. She put the receiver to her ear, lying on the kitchen windowsill. Sure, I'll come over tonight. What's the surprise? Okay, Joker, you don't have to tell me yet, Amelia replied and kissed the receiver. She placed it on the cups and sat down on the chair next to her. She still couldn't catch her breath from the rush to the third floor. Where are you going again, my berry? Mum appeared in the passage with a room ruler in her hand. Bernard is calling me to visit him tonight at his country house. Amelia answered. He's got a surprise for me. When children grow up to the age of 18, they try to sneak out of the house on any pretext. They have institutes, discos, holiday homes. Surprises, her mother waved her hands indignantly. Amelia laughed audibly. She loved her mother for her simple humor, wit, and apt phrases. And at the factory there is no place for princesses. But her daughter Vivian tried, on the contrary, to bring up calm, refined, and easy. Only Amelia still took from her a handful of catchphrases and the ability to joke. When combined with her looks, she turned out to be a good-looking girl. As Vivian liked to say, "You always look forward to the start of summer, and June always seems to come late." And so it was in 1987. And time always goes faster for those who are in love. They don't notice anything around them. They only live with the desire to meet, and they miss each other with their whole being. Bernard and Amelia met a year ago in a queue at a shop. Amelia took someone else's seat without knowing it. The man who came back started arguing with her, and Bernard intervened. "You should be ashamed of your bickering with a girl." My good man, he appeared in front of them, as if by magic. "What do you want more than anyone else? You should have stood in your place and kept quiet when the elder speaks." The rude man glanced at him unhappily. "So I kept silent while the elders spoke." Bernard grinned, giving the boor a caustic but righteous look. "And now I don't see any elders." He swiveled his head around, deliberately not noticing the man sitting down. Amelia stared at the boy curiously, and her heart quickened. The man took offense but remained silent. Bernard gently put his arm around Amelia's shoulder and said loudly, "Comrades, do not be indifferent to rudeness. Today you are being rude in the queue, tomorrow on the bus, and the day after tomorrow you will start to behave in this way. It is shameful and unacceptable." Amelia realized that he was leading her to the exit, amidst the shouting and shouting of the grandmothers in the queue. She could barely contain herself from laughing, and Bernard kept saying something. The queue began to cheer him on and resent the man who had insulted the girl. So and so only. We good citizens will fight back against boorishness, permissiveness. Bernard hid behind one of the doors of the shop, nudging Amelia. She felt that he could hardly contain his laughter and was ready to laugh too. When they were finally outside and ran round the corner, they both burst out laughing. "You're a revolutionary leader," Amelia laughed loudly. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father is a big fan of oratory when he drinks," Bernard said, holding his stomach. When they laughed and wiped away their tears, they finally decided to introduce themselves to each other. "Oh," Amelia realized, "I've been sent for milk. And where can I get it now that you've opened a branch of the Communist Party in the shop?" Bernard laughed again, clutching his side. "Ridiculous. I can't." "All right, I got you into these games. I'll get me out for milk," he said cheerfully, when the laughter died down. That day they walked until the evening, laughing again and again, attracting the attention of passers-by and scaring the birds in the bushes. Milk was not on the family table until the 11th hour, but that was the least of Amelia's worries. Bernard was 2 years older than the 17-year-old girl. He had already finished school and was in his first year at a technical institute. She also felt as if she had known him all her life. So easily and smoothly flowed their communication from the first day. Soon it became clear that the young people were in love, not just friends. Vivian tried at first to prevent these meetings. But when in love and stubborn, Bernard sat all night at the door of their flat on principle, only because Vivian cut off the conversation with him by closing the door. The woman gave up. "If I don't let him in, he'll drag you in himself." Amelia, she replied to her daughter's cheerful look. Contrary to Vivian's fears, Amelia didn't abandon her studies in the final year of high school because of love, and even, on the contrary, pulled up her debts and lagging subjects. Turns out that was Bernard's job too. "If something happens, go where your heart asks, not where you get," he said repeatedly. "Girls, do you think I'm excited about being a technician? I want to serve people, do something for my state, study history, law, not fix tractors." "Isn't that serving the people?" Bent her head over her textbooks, Amelia asked. Bernard sighed tiredly. It happened very rarely. Most of the time he was always in a cheerful mood. Everyone wants to serve people in their own way. He twirled his pencil in his hands, sitting next to her at the table. Some people build ships, and some people run them. Swap those two, and nothing good will come of it. Everyone has their place and their job in life. By doing someone else's work, you're not serving, you're living. Or worse, you spoil what others create. Amelia listened with interest. Such conversations were repeated periodically. "So, you are going to the cottage of the bow until night?" Mother opened the tap, pouring water into the watering can. "There's a phone there, at the neighbor's. I'll call from her when I leave." Amelia nodded and left to take a bath and wash the laundry in pleasant anticipation. The girl knew the way to the cottage perfectly well, because she had been there several times in secret from her mother. Nearby there was a forest and a river flowing. In the neighborhood were scattered a few more dacha plots with rows of apple trees and carved arbors. Before she reached the right house, she saw common friends and girlfriends in the yard. Guys were grilling sausages and vegetables on the fire. Someone was playing badminton. Music from a cassette recorder was blasting out familiar tunes. Bernard jumped out of the house to meet her, greeted her, and gave her a big hug. "So what's the celebration?" Amelia peered in curiously and greeted the other partygoers. "And to get together with friends, you need some kind of occasion," Bernard replied immediately. Amelia smiled and suddenly remembered. "Oh, I'm going to go to Grandma Irma's to call her so Mum won't worry." She hurriedly left her bag on the porch and rushed to her neighbor's house. "You didn't tell her?" "Yes?" Bernard asked Michael's best friend, staring at the girl's back. "I didn't." The smile faded from Bernard's face for a moment. "It's better that you don't know, and don't get yourself all worked up if you do." In case Michael clapped him firmly on the shoulder. When Amelia came back, Bernard met her, hiding his hands behind his back. The girl tried to playfully look behind his back, but he deftly dodged her lunge and laughed. "What have you got there?" "Show me." She resented him playfully as the game dragged on. Bernard lured his lover to the veranda of the cottage and finally pulled out from behind a green box with a thin ribbon. "I didn't know whether you would like it or not, but I really wanted to give it to you," he said as he handed it to Amelia. The girl opened the box, sitting down on the old creaky sofa against the wall. Inside she saw a white cloth with blue cornflower flowers scattered over it. She lifted it up and realized she was holding a light summer dress below the knee with lantern sleeves and a lace-up back. "It's so beautiful," she looked at Bernard, who was standing next to her. "Thank you. I really like it." "Wear it tonight?" the boy asked. Instead of answering, she nodded, grabbed him by the neck and kissed him on the cheek, and then with the box she walked away into the coolness of the cottage corridor. All evening the guys had fun, singing songs to the guitar, and almost at night they sat on the porch under the lantern, wrapped in plaid, and told scary stories, as in childhood in summer camp. Amelia could smell the warm embers, the river, the pine needles. She heard the lanterns moving away, the night moths. She felt Bernard's hand gently squeeze her palm in his. Felt the soft fabric of the dress flowing over her body like moonlight over the quiet surface of a small pond. "I suppose that's happiness," thought the girl, clinging more tightly to Bernard's warm body. And they fell asleep together after midnight on the old sofa, where crickets chirped and leaves rustled, and the sleep was so sound and serene. It was as if some higher power stood guard over it. In the morning, Amelia did not find Bernard in the house, and her friends only spoke briefly of his having gone away very early. She had not seen Bernard again since that day. She couldn't get the truth out of anyone and cried a bucket of tears in helpless incomprehension of what had happened. Abandoned, lost, betrayed. Why? Why? The questions tormented her and drove her into a mire of uncertainty. Could something have happened to him? But why doesn't anyone do anything then? And why are my questions persistently ignored? All of Bernard's friends, parents, and just about everyone who was even slightly involved in this story. Vivian saw how worried her daughter was and didn't know what could be done. She didn't understand what had happened either and tried to comfort her. But how can an ordinary person cope with a broken heart? There's only one doctor who can treat such wounds. Time. "Bernard, you look like you've seen a ghost." Brian waved his hand gently in front of the mayor's eyes. "Maybe I did," Bernard muttered. His face froze in concentrated amazement as he looked at the young singer. It was as if the man was looking for something familiar but long forgotten in the girl's appearance. A few more songs were played in the restaurant, and then the young artist thanked the audience and ran down from the stage for a short break. Only the blue cornflowers on her dress flashed bright rain in the stage lighting. A guy with a guitar took her place and started playing a modern motif familiar to many. Bernard sat there, unable to get up and leave the restaurant. Although they had long ago paid for the order and were just finishing their tea from the clear teapot, Megan sang and then briefly left the stage again. One of the guests gave her a small bouquet. The girl smiled radiantly at the giver. "You take flowers from strangers, but you don't want them from me." The singer's hand was caught by someone's clinging fingers in the wardrobe corridor, where she rushed to take a break. "I don't want to, and I won't accept it." She jerked her hand, but couldn't get away. Angry brown eyes stared at the girl from beneath fleshy eyebrows. 10 years ago, you would have been sitting in my car and not crying," said the man in the black t-shirt with an expressive scar across his right eyebrow, smiling wickedly. "You're hurting me. Let go." Megan jerked again, but the hand was held firmly. "Something's breaking, you fool. You're not a little girl anymore." "That grown-up uncles don't just let go," grinned the offender and dragged Megan, who was pulling away, towards him. The smell of strong tobacco and brandy hit her nostrils. "Grown-up uncles should know that it's low and disgusting to offend the younger ones." An unfamiliar voice came from behind the offender. The man in the black t-shirt looked back. "Just because you're from here, Mr. Mayor?" He snapped at the sight of the new guest in the corridor. "You want trouble to add to your reputation?" Megan could hear her own heart pounding, the flutter of a frightened bird in her temples. "So what's going on here?" "Nicholas again." A new guest burst into the corridor in a sonorous, accented voice, attracting attention. "Let go of the singer in my restaurant immediately. Behave yourself. If not, then get out of here." Nicholas did not contradict the owner. He let Megan's hand go, pointed his finger angrily at everyone, grabbed his jacket from the cloakroom counter and, waving the door, ran out. "Bernard, 1,000 apologies." Bernard turned to the stranger and smiled. "My son's foot will no longer be here. I hope this misunderstanding won't leave a black stain on my restaurant." "I'll have a stain." The man tugged at his jacket, but it wouldn't hurt to hire security. For the staff, he emphasized the last word expressively. The elderly American vowed to assure the mayor that he would do his best, then noisily ordered the kitchen to prepare a few of the most expensive dishes and pack them for his guest as an apology. Only the singer and her sudden intercessor remained in the empty corridor. "Thank you for stepping in." Megan thanked her gently. "And you? I didn't hear you." "You're welcome," the man smiled. "My name is Bernard Snigarev. And what is your name?" The girl shivered uncomfortably. She knew that the city had a mayor, but she had never tried to remember his face. Megan, the singer, introduced herself. Bernard looked at her carefully and again involuntarily searched for familiar features in her appearance, and I think he noticed them. "Tell me, please, is your mother's name Amelia by any chance?" Bernard asked in a muffled voice. "Yes," nodded an embarrassed Megan. "How did you know?" "Many years ago I gave a beautiful girl a dress, just like the one you are wearing now." Bernard sighed sadly. "And somehow I'm sure it was your mum. Megan, I want your permission to talk to her. If she wants to, of course." He pulled his wallet out of his inside jacket pocket and handed Megan a business card. "If she wants to, then please give me a call." Another man in a black suit and mustache came out of the hall. In his hands he held 2 large bags containing an apology from the owner of the establishment. "Bernard, are you all right?" the man asked with seasoned concern. The mayor nodded and asked in the cloakroom for his coat. "I have to go, government business. Pleased to meet you." Bernard smiled as he put on his coat. "You're a very talented girl. Don't give up singing under any circumstances. You have a talent from God. Have a good evening. Goodbye." "Goodbye." Megan stretched out, glancing at her sudden advocate. In her hand, she held the stern business card of this light, pleasant, and somehow childishly warm man. The clatter of his heels echoed off the glass shop windows of the main street. The sharp toes of the shoes carried their owner confidently forward on the pavement. A black car pulled up alongside her on the road. A thin brunette in a red trouser suit and a white coat with a short pixie haircut was reflected in the tinted glass. "Girl, your mum doesn't need a son-in-law." The glass slid down, and a man with a short haircut and a scar across his right eyebrow leaned out of it. "Very funny dame," Karen replied without a single vein in her face or turning her head. "You should have played along for once." The man grumbled resentfully. "Maybe I want to feel young? Then go to kindergarten." Again coldly cut off the young lady. "Are you on business? Do I have business in the city center, or were you passing by? Or maybe you missed me, dear Nicholas." But immediately he grumbled and got to the point. "All right, let's talk. Did your husband come round for dinner last night?" Karen stopped. The passenger door slammed shut. The car merged into the traffic on the road. "Nicholas stepped in when I was courting the local elite. Peacekeeper in a jacket. What a guy. Why would he protect some poor girl who works weekends as a DJ in this pathetic diner?" Karen stared ahead, unblinking. "So who knows him?" Nicholas shrugged his shoulders. "But I noticed from the car later that he'd given her a business card. Have you ever seen a mayor give out his details to a cleaning lady like that?" "My husband is a good soul, but even he wouldn't do such a stupid thing," Karen said. "Who is she anyway, do you know?" "A poor student, lives with her mother in the suburbs." Nicholas happily poured out the data. "No father, no brothers, but she shows character." "Oh, I like that kind of woman. I don't know what to say." Karen glanced at him from under her thick black eyebrows. "But she doesn't compare to you, of course." Nicholas immediately realized. "You're dreaming. You're a goddess. I'll find out about this family of abandoned women, and you make sure Bernard doesn't go quietly to your primary this week." Karen suddenly turned round and deftly rubbed Nicholas's cheek with her fingers. "Only I can have my secrets." Nicholas glowered like a dog that had finally got a coveted bone. The car stopped in the car park of a large columned building. Karen tapped her heels on the pavement again, sent him a kiss, and disappeared through the door. "What a woman. I'd sell my soul," Nicholas muttered as he looked at her. Megan stayed home on Sunday, her only day off. She was afraid to tell her mum what had happened and decided to think it over. What connections could the mayor of the town have with her mum, who had worked as a seamstress in a textile shop for most of her life? Although, according to Bernard, it all happened a long time ago. But then why doesn't she know anything about the story? Megan looked at her mother, who, rocking back in her chair, was knitting intently. "We should start with the dress." After all, it must have been the pretext for the conversation, albeit one that happened under uncomfortable circumstances. "Your dress made a sensation at the restaurant last night." Megan sat down next to me on the old sofa. "I knew it." "Becca." Without taking her eyes off her knitting, Amelia said warmly. "This is a very special dress." "It is." Megan nodded. "So special that the mayor recognized me in it. I think he mistook me for you." The spokes in Amelia's hands stopped moving and froze. "And the mayor?" "Don't be nervous." Megan dashed over to the pill table where the sedatives were. "I just want to know what all this means." Amelia took the glass of valerian from her daughter's hands and took a deep breath. She talked about how she'd met Bernard and how she'd received that dress as a gift on the eve of his disappearance. After a year, I had come to terms with it. 2 years later, I'd almost stopped being sad. After 5 years, I realized it was time to forget the story and put everything that had once bound me to him in the deepest drawer. Amelia wiped the tears from her cheek. "I learned, and in that time I started working. I met your father, moved away. In the hustle and bustle of those days, every day was a surprise. There was no time to grieve for my first love. Then you came along. It all made sense from there." Megan was silent. "Dad didn't know either?" she asked after a while. "Of course not." Amelia shook her head. "David was an honest worker, and your grandmother Vivian assured me that there would be peace behind such a one. And I gave in and agreed. What was there to do?" "Yes, Grandma was always a realist." Megan agreed somewhat awkwardly. At the same time, she glanced in the direction of the framed picture of her father. He had died when she was 8 years old. A man had been stabbed to death in a night alley for a couple of $1,000s. Some scumbag. The police found him and put him away, but there was no bringing David back. Amelia had started working very hard after his death to support herself and her daughter. Megan suspected that was how she'd undermined her health, trying to hide her longing and pain behind her sewing machine. Amelia had forgotten that life can also be joyful. He gave me this at the restaurant. Megan handed her mother Bernard's card. He asked for permission to talk to you. Amelia touched the displaced white cardboard. It felt slightly warm, as if a sparkle from the June evening had suddenly touched her fingers. The surname is wrong, Amelia whispered. But no one but he could recognize the dress. Megan replied in the same whisper. Amelia sucked in a breath. Then she closed her eyes and looked inside herself. She saw a meadow with cornflower blossoms blooming hesitantly at the edge. All right, she turned to her daughter. Tell him I agree to talk. Bernard took a deep breath and put his hand to his chest. On his lap was a bouquet of blue roses. The freshest, Brian said confidently, noticing the chief's agitation in the rearview mirror. There were no more appropriate spring flowers. I should have gone alone. It would have been quicker to pack. I can feel my heart pounding, Bernard complained. Would you go alone, Bernard? Brian turned from the busy street into the narrow gap. I'm not just a driver after all, I'm also a friend and somewhere even a bodyguard. Brian, you know I've been trained too, and I can defend myself if necessary, the mayor grumbled. Carefulness never hurt anyone. Brian calmly tapped his jacket where the gun rested in the pocket under his arm. The car stopped at the right address as the navigator politely announced, I'll stay on duty. I can see the windows of the flat, Brian said, turning off the engine. I'm sure there's no danger waiting for me there, Bernard said. I'm sure, said Brian. Bernard took the bouquet and opened the door. The hallway echoed with the sound of footsteps on old steps and the smell of scrubbed concrete floors. A bell rang in the flat. Megan ran to the peephole. She had thoughtfully excused herself from her date to stay home as a support group. Amelia was very nervous, not knowing whether to expect a visit from an official or a live chance to meet a long-forgotten past. Hello, come in quickly, Megan hurried the high-ranking guest like some boy. Come on, Mum's waiting in the room. Bernard intercepted the bouquet and carefully followed the girl down the long, narrow corridor. He had seen and done much in the stream of his career, but he had not been so anxious for a long time. The room was bright, the morning sun falling through the lace tulle on the carpet, the walls sparkling. On the shelves, old-fashioned chandeliers glided across the lacquered arms of a rocking chair. Mum, this is Bernard, Megan introduced her guest, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Amelia stood by the table in a decent dress and stared in amazement at the man who had entered. And this is my mum, Amelia. She was Amelia Smith before her marriage, Bernard finished. They looked at each other as if they were ghosts, suddenly resurrected from oblivion. It was like looking at a sunset, like looking at the first long-awaited flowers in spring. Megan involuntarily grasped the special importance of the moment and quietly retreated away from the room. She would be close by, but very carefully, Amelia. She recognized and did not recognize Bernard, but he recognized her at once. You can't find wildflowers in November, though I've been round all the flower shops, Bernard said with a faint smile as he quietly approached her and handed her a bouquet of blue roses. Amelia took it with one hand and then, without delay, hugged the man tightly right by the collar of his jacket. She was crying to the point of tears. Brian was reading a book in the car, occasionally glancing at the windows of the right flat, where a melodrama that would be the envy of famous playwrights was unfolding. Megan looked into the room with the vase in her hands 20 minutes later and found her mum and Bernard sitting on the sofa. He held her palm reverently in his. How ashamed I was that I did that many years ago, Bernard said. I was expelled from a technical college, and rightly so. It wasn't my thing. I admit I behaved like a lot of happy male students. They get drafted. Megan was eavesdropping, but she didn't dare enter the room. She stood at the door with her visa in hand. "I would have waited for you as long as I had to, I would have." Amelia answered quietly, not removing her palm. "I know. Do you remember what happened then?" Bernard looked into her eyes. "I knew, I felt intuitively, that I would not just be drafted but taken to Afghanistan. I was on my way to the unit. I knew it. How? I have no idea. But it happened. 6 months later, we were deployed." Amelia felt goosebumps run up her neck and glanced at the barely visible scar on Bernard's forehead, which he had skillfully disguised with his haircut. "Yes, it's a reminder," he said, following her gaze. "And out there, every day is like the last. You don't know if you're going to eat in the evening, and you don't remember when you slept. It's okay. My year there was like a lifetime. Wounded a lot of times, but not seriously. I reached the rank of staff sergeant. A month before the Soviet troops left Afghanistan, we were ambushed. The convoy was shot. I was stunned. I woke up in hospital with 2 wounds in my leg, a stitched-up head and a disfigured face. I remembered almost nothing, who I was, where I was. Picked up by ours, who happened to be nearby." Bernard sighed heavily. Amelia listened to his words and, afraid to miss a word, listened to the narrator, while Megan stood hugging a vase in the corridor. "The papers were left in that car," Bernard continued. "So, almost without memory, wounded and depersonalized, I stayed in the border areas with Afghanistan. How I recovered and how long I traveled back, I don't even want to say. Only my relatives and friends had already buried me by the time I got home. And then I learned to live again. I restored my documents, but I decided to keep my old surname with this cursed war. A friend of mine died on the day of the attack. He said that he was the only son in the family, and that if he died, he would not pass on his surname. I paid tribute to him by becoming Snegjarev. But why didn't you find me? Didn't tell me that you were alive and well?" pitifully asked Amelia, almost in a whisper. "I couldn't. I did a terrible thing by leaving you. I thought it would spare you the pain of loss. Shame was my constant companion. When my memory was restored, my face healed this way and that. Shame drove me to pursue my career. I probably wanted to apologize to you, silently doing what I had to do in my position. And when I saw your daughter at the restaurant in that dress, the shame burned me out, ate away at me. It's like I woke up from my own deception." Bernard undid the top button of his shirt, which was pressing on his throat. "I realize I have no right to claim anything and ask for forgiveness, but I'm willing to do anything just to know that you're alive and well." Amelia sobbed. Suddenly, tears rolled from her eyes. She buried herself in Bernard's chest. He put his arms around the woman. "Mom has cancer," Megan said slowly, appearing in the doorway. "We've been fighting it for 2 years now." Bernard pulled the crying Amelia away from him and looked into her face. "We will cure you. Do you hear me? I'll do everything I can, and even I can't. I only gained you, not to lose you again." When the emotions subsided, the roses were still placed in the water. Megan managed to bring a tray of tea into the room. When Bernard finally walked back outside to the car, it was getting dusk. Brian was nonchalantly reading a tabloid and sipping coffee from a thermos. Bernard told Amelia everything that had happened after the war, how he'd studied history, how he'd moved to this town and got involved with gangsters, how he'd started a business, and how he'd ended up where he wanted to be in management. He also told her that he had married foolishly in the dashing 90s, and then didn't want to spoil his reputation by divorce. When Bernard hugged her tightly, he could hardly hold back the tears, either of joy or of shame. "That's how it is in life," he said to Brian as he got into the car. "Once you find happiness, you can lose it again." The door slammed shut, the Jeep roared and sped away. As soon as the mayor's motorcade was 2 houses away, a low black car pulled out from behind the garages in the courtyard. The window rolled down. "Karen will be very interested to know that the mayor of the city makes individual visits to some slum," the driver said with a chuckle, lighting a cigarette. A few days passed. Megan noticed that Mum had blossomed. She began to purposely seek out the local news on the television for a chance to get a glimpse of Bernard. In fact, Amelia had hardly ever watched TV before. She had no idea what was going on in the government, and who was in charge. Megan was happy to see her mother sitting by the window, embroidering a bouquet of cornflowers with care and reverence, and humming something softly, with just her lips. It was a long time since she had seen her so joyful and smiling. Bernard sometimes called, but these conversations were short. Everyone realized that the prominent city official might not have time. One day Megan, leaving her flat, ran into Bernard's familiar, mustachioed companion at the entrance. The man handed her a huge basket of various fruits, turned away, and rolled away. Megan found a note in the basket, but she was careful not to read it out of respect for her mother. She just solemnly brought the gift into the flat, and grabbing a couple of apples, hurried to work. Megan hadn't yet figured out how she felt about Bernard herself, but it was definitely something warm and respectful. And how could it be otherwise when the man had made her mum happier and protected her from an insolent man in a restaurant? Megan remembered the mayor's promise to help with her treatment. It warmed her soul, but she realized that she couldn't live on hope, so she still went to the restaurant every day, except Sunday, and sang. Grandmother Vivian said to her little granddaughter better a tit in hand than a crane in the sky, and Megan was well aware that her grandmother meant a secure income and savings. On her way to work, Megan encountered an unpleasant situation. She was walking along the pavement with headphones on, looking at passers-by and immersed in her thoughts. Because of the loud music, the girl didn't even immediately notice that a silver foreign car blocked her way at the pedestrian crossing. Megan absent-mindedly glanced at the traffic light, where a green man was moving rhythmically. She hadn't mistaken anything. It was about time to go. But the car was right up against the pavement, right on the zebra, as if on purpose. Megan shrugged her shoulders and tried to go around the side of the car, but it suddenly moved forward aggressively, blocking her path again. "Hey, what's the matter?" The girl was outraged, pulling out her earpiece and glaring angrily at the driver through the tinted windscreen. The emergency lights on the car came on. The driver's door glass went down. "Hello, darling," came a mocking female voice from inside. That's what a restaurant singer is like, it turned out. Megan's throat tightened with an invisible vise. "Let me through. I'm in a hurry," she raised her voice. "It's okay if the restaurant guests don't hear a couple of your songs, but they'll get a better rest," came from the car. "Now you're going to turn right, go down to the car park, and there we'll talk to you." Go to hell. Megan was pissed. What else can she do? She kicked the front bumper of the foreign car irritably. The head of a woman with a short haircut and black hair and sunglasses peeked out of the window. "Look, trashy, I'm not in the habit of repeating myself twice. Or maybe I should ask your sick mummy to take you to the car park by the hand." Megan got a chill inside. That cheeky bitch behind the wheel knew too much. Who knows what else she might know and how to use it if the altercation continued. The girl slowly took a step back onto the pavement, turned right and slowly walked down the alley. The car followed. That's what Megan saw with her side vision. 100 meters, 50-20. She stopped. The car turned abruptly into the nearest parking space. A woman in a green business suit, wearing black high-heeled glasses, stepped out of the car door. The stranger came within arm's length of Megan, slowly removed the dark glasses from her face, and gave her the kind of squeamish look one usually gave beggars in a crosswalk. "Okay, sweetheart," Karen slowly folded the temples of her glasses. "Today you're telling Mummy that she had a dream about meeting the mayor, and you're living exactly the same life you were living before. You go to your dull school, where they teach you trivialities like frying cutlets and stewing cabbage. You run to work at the diner and never stick your nose out again. Is that clear? Why would I listen to a rich bitch like you?" Megan snapped boldly, though her heart was pounding in her chest like a madman. Karen squinted unkindly. "But you wouldn't want a sick mummy to suddenly have a heart attack, would you? Or maybe the young singer got hit by a car on her way home from work completely by accident. Of course, there are so many unfair accidents in our world." She wiggled her eyelashes mockingly, mimicking non-existent tears. "And believe me, I'll make sure those accidents don't get investigated." Megan was silent, holding back her emotions, though a hurricane was raging inside her. Karen threw her a defeated look. "It's a good thing you're so smart, you dopey little thing." She opened the car door. "I'm not going to let it go." So I'll see you later, darling." The car roared its engine and soon disappeared around the corner. Only when it was out of sight did Megan let tears fill her eyes. She clutched her nose, trying in impotent rage to find a packet of paper napkins in her bag. Really, it was silly to believe that some mythical wizard in a blue helicopter would appear and show her a film for free, like the song of a long-watched cartoon. In life, miracles don't happen for nothing, and you have to pay for everything. Well, if it's with money. Megan hurriedly wiped her burning face with her sleeve, unable to find any tissues in her bag. What she feared most was not the threats of the strange lady, but how she could take away her mother's newfound hope for recovery. Or maybe something else to take away the good things that had revived her desire for life. The girl walked down the street with her head down in intense anger. She blamed herself for her naivety and belief in the impossible, blamed that idiotic evening in the restaurant, even the notorious dress with cornflowers, because it had been the key that had brought their small and poor family together with the first man in town. The next day, the girls' college classes were canceled, and she stayed home until evening. Megan decided not to let her mother know what had happened, although in her heart she was tormented by what she was about to do. In order not to sit in tedious idleness, the girl decided to cook dinner, but the refrigerator did not have enough food for the planned dish. Megan peeked into her mother's room, took her bag from the small rack on the wall, threw on her jacket, and slipped out of the flat. It was windy outside. A light fog crept lazily along the streets, enveloping houses, trees, and roads in its wet embrace. Fascinated by this gloomy beauty, Megan didn't even immediately notice the unfamiliar car at the exit of the courtyard. When Megan returned with a full bag of various groceries, she was greeted by Brian. "Good afternoon." "Hello," the girl belatedly replied, looking round the car. Brian opened the backseat door for her. Megan hesitantly climbed in, where she saw Bernard. "I wanted to come see you tonight, but honestly, I couldn't resist this afternoon," the mayor said. There was a sense of joyful impatience in his voice. Megan glanced questioningly at her companion, then at Brian, who was standing delicately outside, contemplating the courtyard. "I made an appointment with a wonderful oncology doctor in the capital the other day. He's ready to see your mum this week, prescribe the most up-to-date medication, and perform surgery if necessary. Brian will drive you to the airport," Bernard assured her fervently. A wave of gratitude and hope surged inside Megan. She suppressed those feelings with great effort, remembering the threat of the woman in the green suit. Who is she, wife, mistress? Should I tell the mayor what happened? What if by doing so I put myself in a nunnery and put my mum in even more danger? The power games of men can be ruthless, especially to those who are poorer and more defenseless. You know, thanks for the trouble, really. But you shouldn't have, Megan said with an effort. Bernard's eyebrows rose. I don't think I'm old enough to have auditory hallucinations. What's wrong? Perplexed, he looked at the girl again. Megan held the grocery bag awkwardly in her hands and felt the husks falling onto the perfectly clean car mat beneath her feet. You'd better stop coming here and stop calling my mum too, she said quietly but firmly. Only picking an old wound for yourself and her. I'm sure you've got enough to do in a position like this. We'll sort it out ourselves somehow. I'll handle it without any help. Thank you for standing up for me the other day, that's all. We're too different. Let's say goodbye. Goodbye, Bernard. Megan hurriedly jerked the handle of the car and sped out into the street, barely containing her emotions. She felt as if every word she said was a hot coal going down her throat and burning a hole in it. She disappeared hurriedly through the doorway, under Brian's surprised gaze and Bernard's confused one, who knew how much effort it had cost, fear and love at the same time. Amelia walked into the kitchen, where Megan was chopping onions for frying. The woman noticed her daughter's eyes were wet. Did you buy a mean onion? You're crying, she exclaimed. Yes, very stinging, the girl hastily explained, happy that her mother did not understand anything. Fresh, that's right. So you should cut it in water. It doesn't sting your eyes, Amelia advised. I'll cook something tonight too. Maybe Bernard will come round. I'd love to give him some of my mushrooms and cutlets. She tossed her hair dreamily to the side and paused. The first chemotherapy treatment a year ago had thinned Amelia's locks, and now they were uneven. But she'd learned to style them in a way that no one would ever realize she had an ailment. Megan couldn't find it in herself to dissuade her mum from her dreams. It was enough what she'd said to Bernard an hour ago. Life was starting to get back to normal. Only not everyone realized it. Bernard had actually stopped calling. Megan was ashamed in front of him and for not telling her mother, who continued to wait for calls and embroider cornflowers. Again and again she told in the evenings the story of their acquaintance, various sweet moments, looking hopefully out the window at the setting sun. 5 days passed like that. "He must be very busy," Amelia said with a faint sadness. "I guess so," Megan agreed grudgingly. "He's a man with a busy schedule and a lot of commitments." So that the bitterness of the contradictory act did not divide her soul so much. The girl tried to go to work and study, and at home she preferred to do all the household chores, rather than sit idly, sinking into the abyss of painful thoughts. Before the next performance, her hand repeatedly reached for her mother's old dress, but Megan was not allowed to put it on by her conscience. Instead, through much persuasion, she borrowed her bandmates' old dresses. Since the school prom, Amelia had quickly tidied her up. It was more than enough for the evening's microphones. That evening, Megan tucked the green floor-length dress on the hanger into a garment case, packed a snack, and hurried to the restaurant for her Saturday shift. They usually came out the most profitable. "You're almost late," Agnes greeted Megan at the service entrance with a whiff of the scent. "Let's hurry up and change and get into the lounge. It's going to be almost full tonight. 80% of the tables are already booked." "Yeah," Megan said and walked past. The receptionist went deep into the locker room. On Friday and Saturday, the girl came in at 4 o'clock and served tables until 10:30. Then, in half an hour, she had to tidy up, change her clothes, put on makeup, and go out to the guests as a singer. There were indeed a lot of guests that evening, and at about 10 o'clock, the most massive reserved table for a large group began to fill up. Megan rushed to it with a notebook and pencil, but her colleague Lena stopped her. "Do you have to leave soon? Let me take them and you take my two-seater. You'd better calculate it now." Megan nodded with relief and hurried to calculate a couple of departing guests. Then she hurried to the changing room. She hurriedly began to get ready and was soon out of the door of the staff room, holding up the long hem of her dress. Her eyes, out of habit, traveled round the hall again, assessing the mood of the audience. Suddenly she caught a glimpse of someone painfully familiar in the crowd of guests. "Why are you frozen? You're singing," Agnes shouted at her from behind. Everything was already set up for the stage. Megan stood a stone's throw away from her at the large table, where Karen was sitting with a glass of champagne in her hand, surrounded by a cheerful group of people. It was a nice restaurant, cozy, and the food was excellent. "Why not celebrate an anniversary?" Amanda said in the taxi. "You don't usually celebrate 40 years, Karen said. Oh, Amanda grimaced. "I don't believe in that nonsense. And by the way, who flew to Italy 4 years ago?" "That's different," Karen informed her. "Everyone else is already there. Yeah, the girls from the IRS, our businesswoman Linda, Gerald, Bill. He says he's booked the biggest table." Amanda chimed in. "Bernard won't be there again. He doesn't like gatherings." Clara, Karen said with a wince. "I don't think it's proper for the mayor to go out to restaurants with his wife." "But they do it with Natalie," she thought to herself. The woman thought to herself. "But you're having a great holiday without him," the birthday girl winked at Karen. "He's been hunting for you for 3 years now." "I'm begging you," Karen grimaced. "He's only fit to work. A messenger or an earpiece." "Cruel, Karen." Amanda grinned. "Tortured him. The bloke's in love. He takes her flowers, buys her expensive shoes." "Oh," you said, Karen, in a condescending tone. "Well, it's all right. Let him drive. I'm a judge. He's a suspicious bloke with a less than clean past. If he'd been smarter, he'd have found a girl of the right caliber a long time ago. As it is, the mayor drives, the boss drives. From the outside, everything's normal." The taxi rolled up to the restaurant. The women paid and, wrapping themselves in their coats, got out. Karen suddenly looked round the place and wrinkled her nose nervously. "Amanda, why didn't you tell me the name of the place?" I forget the names of places all the time." Amanda dismissed it. "What?" "Yes, that's right," Karen smiled unpleasantly. "There's someone I know. I think it would be perfect for this." Amanda tugged the hem of her dress, and both women, chuckling, disappeared through the doors of the restaurant. The restaurant was full of guests, the owner personally greeting several of them. The waitresses bustled back and forth, filling the tables with drinks and dishes. All the colors of life and the belly feast were perfectly visible from the stage. Other days, Megan ignored it and just sang, imagining herself at the concert as a star with thousands of fans. It warmed her soul. But today she sang through the effort, stiff. Her movements were not as effortless and artistic as usual, and her voice trembled where it never had a problem. There was a woman sitting in the audience who inspired terror in Megan. Her head was buzzing, thoughts swarming. Why did she come? What else does she want from me? Or maybe it's an accident. Maybe there's no need to get worked up. Through the hall, Megan saw that the receptionist first called Agnes over to the large table, and when he left, the elderly restaurant owner, Edward himself, came over to the table and leaned over to Karen and her blonde companion. The longer they talked, the darker the owner's face became. The music played. Megan put down the microphone and left for a 10-minute break. At the bar, an angry rookie administrator came at her. "My starlet, what's wrong tonight? You're not singing. You're just a stage presence. Important guests have complained about you. You're emotionally twisting your words," he said with an accent. "I'm sorry. I think I have a cold." Megan lied. She wouldn't say the real reason. He called the bartender over. 50 grams of cognac for the star. Before Megan knew it, a shot with a hot drink and a slice of lemon was on the counter in front of her. "It's for colds. That's the only way I treat it." The receptionist looked at the girl expectantly. "And so, go back to work." There was nothing to do. The lies told needed to be confirmed. Megan picked up the glass, squeezed her eyes shut, and downed the contents in one swift movement. The cognac burned her insides and spilled into her chest in a warm fountain. "Let me make you some tea. Some herbal tea with honey after your shift," Harry offered sympathetically, watching Megan squirm as she chewed on a lemon slice. "It'll be better for your throat." The girl exhaled, resting her hands on the counter, and shook her head negatively. The cognac had a gradual effect on her. Drinking while working was strictly forbidden, only with the permission of the restaurant owner himself. And considering that Megan had never tasted hard liquor before, the 50 grams had played their part. Vacation time was over, and it was time to get back to work. Megan felt her cheeks burning, either from the drink or from embarrassment over the feelings inside. She made her way to the mirror outside the ladies' room. To her horror, she came face to face with Karen there. "Hello, dearie." The woman greeted her mockingly from beneath her disheveled fringes. "And I told you we'd meet again." Megan froze at the sink, her temples pounding. "How quiet are you today?" Karen looked surprised, fixing her hair in the mirror. "And you're probably singing to a phonograph, aren't you?" "I've fulfilled the conditions. What more do you want from me?" The cognac gave Megan a sudden boldness. "I hear the owner affectionately calls you starlet." Karen ignored the question. "And stars sometimes fall down very fast." She slammed down the powder bottle and grinned crookedly, curving the corner of her lips. Megan realized that she was running out of time and needed to get back on stage. She turned, took a step away. Suddenly she heard the crackle of tearing fabric. "Starlet has lost her tail," Karen said mockingly as she removed a stiletto from the plume of the singer's stage dress. Megan could barely contain the anger and tears that were bursting out of her. She threw a look of sudden hatred at the offender, picked up the rest of the plume, and hurried to the stage. Singing in this state was even worse than before. She lost notes, swallowed words, lost rhythm. Even her constant companion, guitarist Tony, looked at Megan with bewilderment. The first sounds of discontent came from the audience. Megan could already see Agnes shrugging her shoulders guiltily at Harry and the new administrator, pointing at her with her palm. "Put the radio on," came from the end table. "What is this horror?" came immediately from another. "And for such live music you charge a higher reservation rate," outraged the third table. Cheeks scarlet with anger and shame, Megan pushed Agnes onto the stage. She hurriedly took the microphone from Megan's hands. "Dear guests, we sincerely apologize for the quality of our artiste's performance." Agnes began. "We are ready to offer each table a dish as a compliment from the chef." Agnes continued. Outraged voices resounded in the hall again. Tony hastily switched on the DJ, trying to smooth things over. Megan wanted to fall to the ground in shame and self-pity. Red circles danced in front of her eyes from the stage lights. She couldn't remember how she jumped out of the restaurant and ran past the cloakroom and into the street. The chill of a faint breeze slid down her neck and arms, unprotected by the fabric of her dress. Only here, on a shapely bench a little away from the door, in the juniper bushes, did Megan allow herself to burst into tears. She no longer cared about her makeup, her dress, or her appearance. She'd embarrassed herself and disgraced the restaurant because of a stupid fear, and she'd probably already lost her job. Footsteps sounded nearby. Someone stopped next to the bench. A lighter flickered. "Why are you crying, beautiful?" came a painfully unpleasant voice from above. The girl's shoulders trembling with crying froze. Megan wished she could have imagined it. "Just not. Not now," she muttered. "Are you deaf or something? Rejoice." It came from upstairs again, in a less friendly tone. Megan froze, pressing her hand to her face. The cool wind chilled her skin unpleasantly. She wanted to crawl underground again, but not out of shame, but to seek shelter and protection. "Ah, I see," the voice said. "The tongue is strong. Well, I'm not a big fan of women like that. But they have their own charm and advantages. They don't argue. They don't contradict the beauty. What are we standing here for? Are you cold? Let's go to the bathhouse to warm up a cold hand," demanded Megan's shoulder. She jerked to the side, shaking it off, and saw the man grinning at her. "Cut the comedy, mate," he said, pushing Megan back against the high fence. "I asked nicely, I gave flowers, I offered. And you're acting like a princess. This is wrong. That's wrong. You think you're a star or something." "Just touch me," she screamed, backing towards the bushes in the fence. "And I'll scream." A few more steps and there would be nowhere to go. The only way out of there was through the bushes to the exit to the car park. With a long dress, it was impossible. "Scream all you want," Bill allowed her generously. "No one will hear over the loud music," he mumbled, flicking the ash from his cigarette onto the bench. "It's a restaurant. It's a restaurant. It's always fun on Saturdays. No one cares about your shouting." Megan hesitated and missed the moment when Nicholas grabbed her by the arm, clamped her mouth shut, and dragged her roughly, like a sack of potatoes, to the car. In the window of the restaurant, the girl managed to notice Karen. The woman was interested in what was happening at the entrance, and then mockingly raised her glass, seeing the horror in the eyes of the distraught singer. Megan desperately lashed out, but Nicholas held her tightly, continuing to drag her into the car park. When he opened the door of the back seat and began to push her inside, the girl dodged and bit her kidnapper's finger until it was bloody. Almost instantly, a slap burned her cheek. "You bitch," Nicholas roared in pain. "Well, nothing. With bruises or without, today you'll leave with me." "Help," desperately shouted the girl from the last strength. But her voice was drowned out by the loud music coming from the restaurant. The car door slammed shut and immediately locked. Megan started pulling the handle of the other door, but it was useless. Her pleading froze on her lips. A second, 2, 3. Dreadful anticipation rang in the air. Suddenly there was a commotion outside, and then a bang, and someone fell like a pile of firewood next to the car. "Are you alive?" The door opened after a short beep of the alarm. "I'm fine." "He didn't do anything to you?" That's when Megan saw Bernard. He helped the girl out of the car. Megan was shaking. She instinctively put her cold arms around the mayor. Someone carefully threw a warm jacket over her back. I'm sorry," the girl cried again and mumbled confusedly. "For what I said to you in the car at the house. It was a woman, and she threatened me that my mom would die. She's in the restaurant right now. I wish I'd known. That's the second time you've saved me. I'm sorry." Bernard leaned over and stroked Megan's head soothingly. Then he looked down. "Brian, call the police," Bernard ordered. "He's going on holiday for attempted kidnapping by that drinker." Megan saw the offender lying helplessly on the pavement next to the driver's door, and a man with a mustache, already familiar to her. He was shaking his right hand, clenching and unclenching his fingers. "Bernard, we'll call," Brian said quickly. "The squad's on its way. Only there's something else interesting." Brian didn't have time to finish. Karen came out of the restaurant door, having seen everything that was going on from the window. The sound of her heels was painful to the ears. Megan clung even tighter to Bernard in terror. "Dear husband," she whispered. "What's the surprise?" "Greetings in absentia," Karen continued, spreading her hands apart. "And you said you couldn't come. What changed your plans? Or did you decide to condescend to an evening with your wife?" Bernard didn't say a word. But Karen wasn't going to keep quiet. "I see you've decided to go after the whole family of the underprivileged. First the mum, now the penniless daughter." "Ugh, Bernard." "You're not disgusted," Karen said with a squeamish wince. "Anyway, at least wash your hands afterwards." Megan felt the man tense up but held back, not wanting to respond to the painful lunge. Brian, who was standing nearby, carefully pulled an envelope from behind his back. "Bernard, I think you should take a look at the contents." He held it out to the boss under Karen's gaze. "What are these bribes?" the woman suggested wryly. Megan let go of the mayor and stepped back, allowing him to examine the contents of the envelope. Inside were several pictures clearly taken at different times. Each one captured Karen in or by the car with her lover. They were hugging or kissing. "And you dare to say anything to me after that?" Bernard questioned Brian in a frighteningly calm voice, twisting the photographs carefully in his fingers. Karen finally realized what was in the envelope. She was skewered. Her eyes fidgeted, stopping at the lover behind the company, then at Megan, then at Megan, then at the pictures in her husband's hands. "You're a street creature, madam," Brian commented briefly, turning to Karen. What she arched hysterically. "Get your coachman in line. He has no right to talk to me like that." "I won't think of it," Bernard replied. Karen threw the rest of the champagne from her glass in his face in a furious rage. Megan saw Brian draw 2 lines in the air with his fingers as if drawing a cross, apparently on Karen. Bernard silently pulled a handkerchief from his breast pocket and wiped his face in one motion. Then, just as carefully, he shook it out and tucked it back in. "Honor," he said. With 2 fingers, he slipped the pictures into Karen's empty glass, then turned to Brian. "Now call the police, lad." Megan, already sitting in the mayor's car, watched as the police arrived, as they questioned Bernard and Brian, as Karen waved her arms and proved something, and as the crowd of guests hurried away in a taxi. Karen quickly began to disperse the guests, and then it all blurred into a mess and dissolved into a dream. The clinic glittered with whitewashed corridors and friendly nurses. Megan looked around and waited for her mom at the oncologist's office. Accustomed to provincial polyclinics, where everything was kept on a fair word of 0, if not 90s, the girl was surprised by the cleanliness, novelty, and absence of queues in the capital's medical center. Life had changed in a surprising way. Over the past 2 months, Bernard fulfilled his promise and provided the family with a doctor he knew. However, he found himself at the center of a scandal. That evening at the restaurant, his presence did not go unnoticed, and the ubiquitous paparazzi quickly clicked sensational pictures. The very next day, all news outlets in the region were full of provocative headlines and photos of the mayor's wife throwing champagne in his face. The tabloids implicated the police and Megan, and who knows what else. Then, of course, they issued a retraction, but the scandal was already gaining momentum. Bernard was asked to resign as mayor early. A little later, an obscure yellow paper got hold of the photos from the envelope and started a new round of scandal. Karen was seething with anger and literally destroyed the editorial office, using her power. But it was too late. The whole town was watching the high-profile divorce of its former mayor, savoring it, trashing it on every corner. Nicholas desperately denied the charges against him, but the surveillance cameras from the restaurant didn't give him a chance. Nicholas was sent to a detention center in the city until a court date was set. Nicholas naively thought Karen would help him get away with it, but she'd forgotten all about her wayward lover. Bernard's been ousted as regional minister, so it's kind of a cop-out. Of course, the man was not going to sit idle and do nothing in his new position, but he waited for the hype to die down. How did Bernard get to the restaurant that unfortunate evening? Mother's intuition was to be thanked for that. Amelia had sensed something was wrong during the day she'd phoned her daughter, but with all the commotion and guests, Megan didn't have time for the phone. She only remembered her things when Brian brought her home and carefully removed them from the boot. Abandoning her unsuccessful attempts to reach her daughter, Amelia dialed Bernard's number. He listened to the woman without question and answered. "We're on our way, dropping all business." Amelia's premonitions were correct, and Bernard saw Megan being pushed into the car by a familiar scarred man on the way to the restaurant. Brian reacted quickly, and remembering his army school, punched one in the jaw, knocking him to his knees and knocking him out. After what had happened, it was obvious that Megan would not be returning to work. Bernard offered the girl to open a singing school for children. Megan happily agreed, and the business was up and running. Now it was not necessary to work hard in a noisy hall, and it was possible to earn money in comfort and in a pleasant environment. Often Megan wore her mother's dress to classes, considering it lucky, because it was in it that the whole complicated story began. On rare free evenings, Bernard would visit Amelia and Megan, and then everyone forgot about their burdens and problems because they got what their souls had been longing for. Megan loved these evenings. She felt as if she had found her father again. Sometimes, however, the girl felt like the third extra, and then let her mother and Bernard be alone. He always held her hand at such moments, as if still apologizing for something that had happened a long time ago. Amelia gave Bernard a handkerchief embroidered with cornflowers, and since then he always carried the gift with him, considering it a talisman. The doors of the doctor's office opened, and from behind them came Mum's thanks, and soon she herself appeared in the corridor, smiling. "What's up?" Megan jumped up from the couch, impatient. The doctor set a date for the surgery. "The prognosis is good. The metastases have not progressed," Amelia told her. "There's a chance to beat the disease completely, you know." Instead of answering, Megan jumped with happiness and hugged her mother tightly. "It's a miracle," she exclaimed joyfully. "Yes," Amelia stroked her hair. "It's a miracle that I have a daughter. And the rest is the mundane things of life." "Mum, don't say that." Megan was outraged. "Let's go for a walk in Central Park. It's supposed to be beautiful there now, with snow and the fairgrounds open," Amelia suggested, looking dreamily out the window at the snowflakes around us. "Let's drink hot cocoa with marshmallows." Megan laughed, took her mother's hand, and the two of them set off on this little frosty winter adventure.